Hey friends, welcome to the Horror Sleep. Almost 90% of you watching aren't subscribed. If you enjoy these true park ranger horror stories, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps the channel. Oh, and where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments. I'm Evan. I've been a park ranger in the Bitterroot Mountains for the last 12 years. The Bitterroot Mountains line the Idaho-Montana border. If you've never driven through this part of the country, let me paint a picture. Rolling waves of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir as far as the eye can see, and canyons so deep the sun doesn't reach the bottom until almost noon. And the fog. Oh, the fog rolls in like it's got someplace to be, except it's in no rush to get there. Gorgeous country. The sort of stuff that gives you a good reason to see the romance in the idea of the wilds. But it's the sort of country that will kick you back into line fast when you tend to forget that you're just visiting. But as far as my work itself, there wasn't too much about what I did on a day-to-day basis that was particularly unusual. Checking permits, upkeep of the trails, giving educational programs about the importance of leave no trace, and from time to time, I'd get involved in some search and rescue mission where some oblivious soul had managed to get turned around or broken an ankle 10 miles from the nearest trailhead. For 12 years, I'd had my fair share of hair-raising moments, but nothing too disturbing, not really, until the autumn of 2019 and the disappearance of Cole Pritchard, and I began questioning whether, actually, I knew these woods as well as I thought I did. It was late October, right at the tail end of elk season. The aspens had already dropped most of their leaves, and the high country was getting its first serious dustings of snow. Perfect hunting weather, really. Cold enough that the elk were moving down to lower elevations, but not so cold that you couldn't camp comfortably with the right gear. Cole was an experienced hunter, the kind of guy who'd been coming to these mountains since he was a kid. He had all his permits in order, filed his hunting plan with our office like he was supposed to, and even checked in with me personally the day before he headed out. I remember him being excited. He'd drawn a tag for a specific drainage about 15 miles northeast of the ranger station, a place called Tin Cup Creek. It's remote, but not dangerously so. There's a decent trail that follows the creek for about 8 miles before it peters out into game trails and thick timber. "Should be back Thursday," he told me, shaking my hand in that firm way hunters do. "Got enough food for 5 days, but I don't plan on needing it." I nodded, made a note in our log, and wished him luck. That was Monday. Thursday came and went. So did Friday. By Saturday morning, when Cole still hadn't checked back in and wasn't answering his sat phone, his wife called our office in a panic. That's when we started mobilizing. Search and rescue in the Bitterroots isn't like it is in some national parks where you've got helicopters and dozens of volunteers at the ready. We're a small operation. It was me, 2 other rangers named Marcus and Sophia, and whatever volunteers we could pull from the local SAR team. That Saturday, we managed to get a group of 8 together. The plan was simple. Follow Cole's intended route up Tin Cup Creek, look for any sign of him or his camp, and hopefully find him with nothing worse than a sprained ankle and a dead sat phone battery. We headed out just after dawn. The weather was cooperating, clear skies and temperatures in the mid-30s. The trail along Tin Cup Creek is one I've hiked 100 times, and I could probably walk it blindfolded. It follows the creek pretty closely for the first few miles, winding through stands of pine and fir, crossing a few small meadows where you'll sometimes see elk or deer in the early morning. About 4 miles in, there's a spot where the trail climbs away from the creek and switchbacks up a ridgeline. That's where the hiking gets tougher, but it's also where you start getting those views that make all the effort worthwhile. We made good time that first stretch, calling out Cole's name every few minutes and watching for any sign of him. Around the 6-mile mark, Marcus spotted something. Boot prints in a muddy section of trail, fresh enough that they hadn't been washed away by the rain we'd had earlier in the week. They matched the size and tread pattern Cole's wife had described. We were on the right track. "He came through here sometime in the last few days," Marcus said, crouching down to examine the prints more closely. "Probably Monday or Tuesday." We pushed on, following the boot prints where we could find them. The trail got narrower and less maintained as we went, eventually turning into little more than a game trail cutting through thick underbrush. This was the kind of terrain where it was easy to lose your bearings if you weren't careful, but Cole knew these woods. He'd been hunting this drainage for years. Around mile 8, we found his camp. It was set up in a small clearing maybe 50 yards off the main trail, tucked up against a rock outcropping that would have provided good wind protection. Cole's tent was still standing, and I could see his pack leaning against a tree. There was a fire ring with ashes that looked relatively fresh, and various pieces of gear scattered around the site in that organized chaos way that experienced campers tend to arrange things. But Cole wasn't there. "Cole!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the surrounding ridges. "Cole Pritchard!" Nothing. Just the sound of wind moving through the pines. Sophia walked over to the tent and unzipped it. "His sleeping bag's here," she called out. "Looks like he slept in it recently, and there's food, water, most of his gear's still here." That's when the first little spike of real worry hit me. If Cole had gotten injured or disoriented, he would have taken his pack. You don't leave your survival gear behind unless something's very wrong. Marcus was examining the fire ring. Fire's cold, but not ancient. I'd say it's been out for maybe 24 hours, give or take. We spread out and searched the immediate area, looking for any clue about where Cole might have gone. It didn't take long to find his tracks leading away from camp, heading north and slightly uphill, deeper into the drainage. The tracks were clear at first, but as we followed them, something strange started happening. The ground was soft from the recent rain, perfect for tracking, and Cole's boot prints were easy to spot. But after maybe 200 yards, they started to seem off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. They were still the same boot prints, same size, same tread pattern, but they looked different somehow. The depth was inconsistent. Some prints pressed deep into the mud while others barely made an impression, and there was no logical reason for it. The terrain was flat. There were no rocks or roots that would have caused him to step differently. "You seeing this?" I asked Marcus, who was crouched down examining the tracks. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's like he was walking normally 1 second, then barely touching the ground the next. Doesn't make sense." We kept following the prints. They led us through a thick stand of fir trees, the kind of place where the canopy is so dense that even in the middle of the day, it feels like twilight. The temperature seemed to drop as we entered that section of forest, and I noticed that none of us were talking anymore. There was something about the quality of the silence that made you want to keep quiet, like speaking might disturb something you didn't want to disturb. And then the tracks just ended. Not at a stream where they might have been washed away. Not at a rocky section where they'd be hard to spot. They just stopped in the middle of soft, muddy ground mid-stride. One boot print, then nothing. Like Cole Pritchard had taken a step and vanished into thin air. I stood there staring at that final print for a long time, my brain trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Marcus and Sophia came up beside me, and I could feel the same confusion and unease radiating off them. "Where did he go?" Sophia asked quietly. That was the question, wasn't it? I looked around, trying to find any explanation. Maybe he doubled back and stepped in his own prints. But no, there were no returning tracks. Maybe he jumped from that spot to some nearby rocks. But the nearest rocks were at least 10 feet away, and there was no indication of any disturbance in that direction. "We need to expand the search," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He's got to be around here somewhere." We spent the next hour combing every inch of that area. We walked in widening circles, looked for any sign of tracks, any broken branches, any disturbance in the undergrowth. Nothing. It was like Cole had literally evaporated at that exact spot where his final boot print was. By early afternoon, we'd radioed for additional help. 2 more SAR teams were mobilized, and by evening, we had nearly 20 people searching the drainage. We set up a base camp at Cole's site, and teams took turns searching through the night using high-powered flashlights and thermal imaging equipment borrowed from the county sheriff's office. Nothing. Sunday morning came, and we were back at it. The search area expanded to include the surrounding ridges and valleys. A helicopter made several passes overhead, but the thick forest canopy made aerial searching nearly useless. We brought in tracking dogs, and that's when things got even stranger. The dogs followed Cole's scent from his camp to the spot where the tracks ended, and then they lost it. Completely lost it. And these weren't amateur dogs, these were experienced SAR animals that had found dozens of missing people over the years. Their handlers were baffled. The dogs would get to that final boot print, circle around it a few times, whine, and then sit down, refusing to go any further. "I've never seen anything like it," one of the handlers told me. "It's like the scent just stops. No fade, no trail leading away. Just gone." We searched for 5 more days. We covered hundreds of square miles of wilderness. We checked every ravine, every hidden valley, every place a person could conceivably end up if they'd gotten lost or injured. We found nothing. No body, no additional gear, no sign that Cole Pritchard had ever walked past that point where his final boot print sat in the mud. On the 6th day, we had to scale back the search. We didn't have the resources to keep that many people in the field indefinitely. A smaller team, including me, continued searching for another week. But in our hearts, we all knew we weren't going to find him. Cole Pritchard had disappeared in a way that defied every bit of knowledge and experience I had about these woods. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or accident, though they couldn't explain what accident would have left no trace. His wife held a memorial service about a month later. I attended, but I couldn't bring myself to talk to her. What was I supposed to say? That her husband's footprints just ended in the middle of the forest for no reason anyone could explain? I thought about Cole constantly in the weeks and months that followed. I ran through every scenario I could think of. Animal attack, but there was no blood, no signs of struggle, and predators don't make bodies vanish completely. Foul play? But who, and how, and why out there in the middle of nowhere? Some kind of accident. But what kind of accident makes a person disappear mid-step? And then, about 4 months later, something happened that made me realize Cole's disappearance might not have been an isolated incident. It was February, deep winter in the Bitterroots. The high country was buried under several feet of snow, and most of the forest was inaccessible except by snowmobile or cross-country skis. I was at the ranger station doing paperwork when I got a call from a guy named Tom Haskins. Tom ran a small cross-country skiing operation out of a lodge about 20 miles south of our station, taking tourists out on guided ski trips through the winter landscape. "Evan," he said, and I could hear the strain in his voice. "I need to report something. One of my clients, she's missing." My stomach dropped. "When? Where?" "This morning. We were out on the Pine Creek Trail doing a guided tour. There were 6 of them, all experienced skiers. I was in front, and they were following in single file. We stopped at a viewpoint, and when I turned around to talk to the group, one of them was gone. A woman named Patricia Morales. Could she have fallen behind? Maybe gone back to the lodge?" "That's what I thought," Tom said. "But Evan, I called back to the lodge. She's not there. And here's the thing. We backtracked our route. Her ski tracks are there in the snow, following right behind the others, and then they just stop. No turnoff, no side trail. They just end. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I'm on my way. I grabbed my gear and headed out. The Pine Creek Trail was only about a 30-minute drive from the station, and I knew it well. It was a popular route for skiing, following an old logging road that wound through relatively gentle terrain. Not the kind of place where someone should just vanish. When I got there, Tom and the rest of his group were huddled near their van, looking shaken. Tom immediately led me to the spot where Patricia's tracks ended. Sure enough, there they were in the fresh snow. 2 clean ski tracks, the kind of parallel lines that experienced skiers leave, running for about a quarter mile and then just stopping. No sign of her stepping off to the side, no indication that she'd fallen or been pulled off the trail. The tracks just ended, mid-glide. I stood there looking at those tracks, and I felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the winter air. "How long between when you last saw her and when you noticed she was gone?" I asked Tom. "Maybe 10 minutes. We weren't going fast, just a leisurely pace. I'd looked back a few times and she was there. Then we stopped at the viewpoint, and I turned around to point out a landmark and she wasn't in line anymore. And nobody heard anything. No shout, no sound of falling." The others all shook their heads. One of them, a middle-aged man with expensive ski gear, spoke up. "It was quiet out here. Dead quiet. If she'd called out or fallen, we would have heard it." We organized another search, though with a sinking feeling of déjà vu, I already knew how it would turn out. County SAR came out. We combed the area, brought in the same dogs that had failed to track Cole. The results were identical. The dogs would get to the end of Patricia's ski tracks and lose the scent completely. They'd circle, whine, and refuse to go on. Patricia Morales was never found. Just like Cole Pritchard, she had simply ceased to exist at a specific point in the forest, leaving nothing behind but tracks that ended for no reason anyone could explain. But what really terrified me was what I found when I started digging through old missing persons reports. After Patricia disappeared, I couldn't let it go. 2 people vanishing in the same impossible way felt like too much of a coincidence. So I started going through files, looking at every missing person case in the Bitterroot National Forest over the past 20 years. What I found made my blood run cold. There had been others. Not many, maybe one every few years, but they were there. A bow hunter in 2014, a wildlife photographer in 2011, a backpacker in 2006. In each case, the search reports mentioned the same disturbing detail: tracks that ended abruptly with no explanation. I'd been working in these mountains for 12 years, and I'd never put it together. The cases were spread out over time, handled by different ranger teams, and nobody had ever connected the dots. Nobody except me now. I brought my findings to my supervisor, a guy named Jack Forrester who'd been with the Forest Service for almost 30 years. I expected him to be skeptical, maybe even dismissive. Instead, he got very quiet and told me to close the door. "I was hoping nobody would notice," he said finally. "You knew?" "Not at first. But yeah, about 10 years ago, I started seeing the pattern. I reported it up the chain. You know what they told me? Drop it. Don't talk about it. It's bad for tourism, bad for the Forest Service's reputation. People go missing in the wilderness all the time," they said. "Just because we can't always explain it doesn't mean there's anything unusual going on." "But the tracks, Jack, tracks that just end in the middle of—" "I know," he interrupted. "Believe me, I know. I've seen it myself. I was on the search team for the photographer in 2011, watched his footprints just stop in soft mud, no explanation. It's not natural, Evan. But what are we supposed to do? Report that people are vanishing into thin air in our forest? Who's going to believe that? He had a point, but it felt wrong to just ignore it. There has to be an explanation, I said. Something we're missing. Jack sighed and leaned back in his chair. Maybe. Or maybe some things in these mountains don't have explanations we'd understand. You ever talk to the old-timers around here? The ones whose families have been in these valleys for generations. I shook my head. You should, he said. They've got stories, things they don't usually share with outsiders. But if you ask the right questions, they might open up. That conversation led me to a cabin about 30 miles from the ranger station where a man named Arthur Vance lived. Arthur was in his 80s, born and raised in the Bitterroots. His grandfather had been a trapper back in the early 1900s, and his father had worked as a logging foreman. If anyone knew the local legends and stories, it would be Arthur. I found him on his porch, whittling a piece of wood into what looked like it might eventually be a bird. He studied me as I approached, and I had the distinct impression he already knew why I was there. "You're the ranger," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Evan Hartley. I was hoping I could ask you some questions about the forest." He smiled slightly. Questions about what happens in the fog, I'd wager. The way he said it made my skin prickle. The fog? "Sit down, son," he said, gesturing to another chair on the porch. "I'll tell you what my grandfather told me, and what his father told him. But I doubt it'll make you feel any better." I sat. Arthur set down his whittling and looked out towards the tree line. These mountains are old. Older than the maps say. Older than the records show. My great-great-grandfather came through here in the 1850s, trapping beaver. He kept journals. Mentioned places in the forest where the fog would come in suddenly, even on clear days. Thick fog that moved wrong, he said. Not like normal fog that drifts with the wind. This fog had purpose, according to him. It would roll in fast, settle over a particular spot, and then lift just as quickly. And sometimes, people who walked into that fog didn't walk back out. Your great-great-grandfather. Did he say what he thought it was? He didn't know. Nobody did. But there were theories. Some folks thought it was something to do with the old tribes that used to live here, spirits or sacred ground. Others thought it was just the mountains themselves, some property of the land we don't understand. My grandfather, he had his own theory. What was that? Arthur looked at me directly. He thought there were thin places in the world. Spots where the barrier between here and somewhere else gets weak. And when conditions are right, certain times of year, certain weather patterns, those thin places open up. Just for a moment, and if you're unlucky enough to be standing there when it happens, he trailed off. "You disappear," I finished. "You disappear," he agreed. No body, no trace, just gone. My grandfather claimed to have seen it happen once when he was young. He was out checking trap lines with a friend. Fog rolled in sudden-like, and his friend walked ahead into it. Grandfather said he was maybe 20 feet behind, close enough to hear the man's footsteps, and then the footsteps just stopped. When the fog cleared a minute later, his friend was gone. My grandfather found the man's tracks, followed them to the point where they ended, spent 2 days searching, found nothing. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind in the trees. "You believe him?" I asked finally. Arthur shrugged. "I believe he believed it. And I've lived in these mountains my whole life. I've seen things I can't explain. Had days where I'm walking a trail I've walked 1,000 times, and suddenly it feels wrong, like the forest is holding its breath, waiting for something. Those are the times I turn around and head home, even if I'm nowhere near done with what I came to do." The people who've disappeared recently, I said. Was there fog? Can't say for sure about all of them, but I remember when that photographer went missing back in 2011. I was up at Willow Creek that week. There was fog, heavy fog, unusual for that time of year. Rolled in out of nowhere, stayed for about an hour, then cleared just as quick. I remember thinking it didn't feel right. I drove back to the ranger station that evening with more questions than answers. The rational part of my brain wanted to dismiss Arthur's story as folklore, superstition born from trying to explain the inexplicable. But the part of me that had stood at those ending tracks, that had seen the confusion in the search dog's behavior, that part was less certain. Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention to weather patterns in a way I never had before. I pulled records, looking at conditions on the days when people had disappeared, and I found something interesting. In almost every case, there had been reports of unusual fog in the area. Not every time, but often enough that it couldn't just be coincidence. I also started talking to other park rangers in different parts of the country, very carefully and informally. Hey, you ever have searches where the tracks just ended? That kind of thing. Most looked at me like I was crazy, but a few got quiet. A few had stories similar to mine. A ranger in the Cascades, one in the Appalachians, another in the Rockies. Always the same details. Tracks ending mid-stride, scent trails that disappeared, and often, though not always, fog that seemed to come from nowhere. We were in early May when the next incident happened, and this time I was there. I was doing a routine trail check on the West Fork Trail, about 12 miles from headquarters. It was a beautiful morning, clear skies, temperatures in the 50s. Perfect spring hiking weather. The trail was empty except for me, which wasn't unusual for a Wednesday morning. Around 10 a.m., I noticed the temperature starting to drop. Not gradually, but suddenly, like someone had opened a refrigerator door. I stopped and looked around, instincts prickling. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no insects, just an unnatural silence that made my ears feel muffled. And then I saw the fog. It came rolling down from the ridge to my left, moving faster than any fog should move. Thick, gray-white. And as Arthur had said, it moved with purpose. It didn't drift on the wind. It flowed like water, pouring down the slope and spreading across the trail maybe 200 yards ahead of me. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't. I had to know. I had to see what happened in that fog. I approached carefully, my hand on my radio, ready to call for help if needed. As I got closer, I could see that the fog had settled over a specific section of trail, maybe 50 yards across. It wasn't spreading anymore, just sitting there, dense and impenetrable. I stopped at the edge of it. Up close, it was even stranger than it looked from a distance. The fog was completely opaque, and it had a quality to it that I can't quite describe. It wasn't just thick. It felt heavy, almost solid. Like if I reached out and touched it, I'd be able to feel resistance. "Hello?" I called into it. My voice sounded flat, absorbed by the fog instead of echoing like it should have. No response. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, watching, waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog began to lift. It didn't dissipate gradually like normal fog. It rose straight up, like a curtain being pulled, and within 30 seconds it was gone. I immediately walked to the section of trail where the fog had been. I examined the ground carefully, looking for any sign of disturbance, any tracks, anything unusual. The trail was damp, muddy from recent rain, perfect for showing prints. And then I saw them, boot prints, fresh ones, cutting across the trail from the forest on one side to the forest on the other. They hadn't been there before, I was certain of it. I'd walked this exact stretch of trail not 20 minutes earlier. But now there were clear tracks, and they looked Old. Not old like they'd been made weeks ago, but old like they'd been made by someone wearing very old boots. The tread pattern was simple, nothing like the complex designs of modern hiking boots. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my camera and photographed the prints. Then I followed them. They led into the forest on the left side of the trail, heading upslope. I marked the spot and pushed into the undergrowth following the trail. The prints were consistent at first, showing someone walking at a normal pace, heading purposefully up the slope. And then, about 100 yards in, they ended. Mid-stride, just like all the others. One print, then nothing. But this time there was something else. Lying on the ground next to the final print was a small leather pouch. I crouched down and examined it without touching it at first. It looked handmade, the leather cracked and darkened with age. Very carefully I used a stick to open it. Inside were fire-starting materials, char cloth, a piece of flint, and a small steel striker. The kind of primitive fire-starting kit that hadn't been in common use for at least 100 years. I sat back on my heels, my mind racing. These tracks, this pouch. They hadn't been here before the fog, I was certain of it, which meant they'd appeared during or after the fog passed. But how? And who left them? I radioed it in. Within a few hours, I had a small team out there with me, including Jack Forrester. We photographed everything, collected the pouch as evidence, and tried to make sense of what we were seeing. Could someone have planted this? One of the other rangers asked. Some kind of hoax? I was standing right here, I said. Nobody came through while I was waiting, and these tracks weren't here before the fog. Jack examined the leather pouch. This is old, he said quietly. Really old. If it's a hoax, someone went to a lot of trouble to age this properly. We searched the surrounding area but found nothing else. No more tracks, no other signs of anyone being there. Just those boot prints that ended in the forest, and that ancient pouch. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Arthur had said, about thin places in the world. What if the disappearances weren't just people vanishing? What if something else was happening? What if, when that barrier thinned, it worked both ways? The next day, I went back to see Arthur. I showed him the photos of the pouch. He looked at them for a long time, then handed my phone back to me. That's a tinder box, he said. The kind a trapper or mountain man would have carried in the 1800s. My great-great-grandfather had one similar. It appeared right after the fog, I told him, along with tracks that hadn't been there before. Old-style boot tracks. Arthur nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd suspected. There are stories, he said. Not many, and most people don't talk about them. But there are stories about people who've seen things in the forest. People who shouldn't be there. Figures dressed in old-fashioned clothes, trappers and hunters from another era. They appear and disappear. Some folks who've seen them say they look lost, confused, like they don't know where they are or how they got there. You think someone from the past came through when the fog appeared? I think, Arthur said carefully, that if there are thin places, and if people from our time can disappear into them, then maybe people from other times can come out of them. Maybe that's what you saw evidence of. Someone stepping through from 150 years ago, taking a few steps in our forest, and then disappearing back to wherever they came from. It sounded insane, but it also fit the evidence better than any rational explanation I could come up with. Has anyone ever come back? I asked. Any of the people who disappeared, have any of them ever returned? Arthur's expression darkened. No, he said. Once they're gone, they stay gone. Whatever's on the other side of those thin places, it doesn't give people back. I thanked him and left, my head spinning with possibilities and implications. If what Arthur suggested was true, then Cole Pritchard, Patricia Morales, and all the others were somewhere else now. Not dead, but displaced, lost in another time or another place that existed in the same geographic space but was separated by something we didn't understand. Over the following months, I became somewhat obsessed with the phenomenon. I started keeping detailed logs of weather conditions, atmospheric pressure, temperature fluctuations, anything that might help predict when the fog would appear. I talked to meteorologists, physicists, anyone who might have insight into what could cause these events. Most thought I was crazy, but a few were intrigued. One physics professor I talked to mentioned quantum mechanics and the many worlds interpretation, suggesting that maybe these thin places were points where different quantum realities somehow intersected. A meteorologist mentioned unusual electromagnetic readings sometimes associated with certain fog formations, though she couldn't explain what might cause them. None of it gave me answers, just more questions. And then, in August, another person disappeared. This time, it was a young woman named Sarah Kelton, a biology graduate student doing research on pine beetle infestations. She'd been working in a remote section of the forest, taking core samples from trees. When she didn't return to her base camp by dark, her research partner called it in. The search started the next morning. I wasn't on the initial team, but when I heard the details, tracks that ended abruptly near a stand of dead pines, I immediately asked to be included. By the time I got there, they'd already found her camp, her research equipment, and the ending tracks. I walked up to the search coordinator, a county SAR volunteer I'd worked with before. "Tell me everything," I said. "Not much to tell." She left camp yesterday morning around 7, told her partner she was heading to a specific grove of pines about a half-mile northeast. She had her radio, checked in at 8:30 saying she was starting work. That was the last anyone heard from her. Partner went looking when she didn't come back by dark, found her research site and her equipment laid out like she'd been in the middle of working, but no Sarah. Followed her tracks back from the site toward camp, and they just... Stop. Was there fog yesterday? He looked at me strangely. Fog? In August? Not that anyone reported. Why? I didn't answer. I went to look at the ending tracks myself. Sure enough, there they were. Boot prints in soft soil, showing Sarah walking back toward camp, and then nothing. No sign of struggle, no disturbance, just tracks that ended as if she'd evaporated mid-step. But something was different this time. As I crouched next to the final print, I noticed something in the soil. Frost crystals, tiny but distinct, forming a small circle around where the last print was, in August with temperatures in the 70s. I touched the ground. It was cold. Actually cold, like it had been refrigerated. "Get the thermometer," I called to one of the other rangers. "And the camera. I need to document this." The ground temperature in that specific spot was 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Everywhere around it was normal, matching the ambient air temperature. But in a circle about 3 feet in diameter, centered on that last footprint, the ground was significantly colder. I photographed it, documented it, and tried not to let my excitement show. This was evidence. Physical, measurable evidence of something unusual happening at the point of disappearance. It might not tell us what happened to Sarah, but it proved that something had happened, something that left measurable effects. The search for Sarah lasted a week. Like all the others, we found nothing. But I kept that temperature reading and I kept investigating. Over the next few months, I managed to get access to historical records from the Forest Service and local newspapers going back to the 1950s. I documented every disappearance that matched the pattern. Tracks ending unexpectedly, no body found, no clear explanation. I found 17 cases over 70 years, and when I plotted them on a map, a pattern emerged. They weren't random. The disappearances clustered in specific areas of the forest, areas that formed a rough grid pattern, like they were happening at the intersection points of some kind of invisible network. 5 main zones, each about 15 miles from the others, arranged in a pattern that didn't match any geological or ecological features I could identify. I showed the map to Jack Forrester. He looked at it for a long time, then pulled out a different map, an old topographical map from 1923. "Look at this," he said, laying it next to mine. I looked. The 1923 map showed old trapper trails, long since overgrown and forgotten. And those trails intersected at points that matched almost exactly the locations where people had disappeared. "The old-timers knew," Jack said quietly. "Somehow, they knew to avoid certain places. These trails were designed to get through the mountains while bypassing these specific spots. But why? How did they know? Same way people have always known about dangerous places. Experience, trial and error. Enough people disappearing in certain spots, and eventually the survivors learned to avoid them." It made sense in a grim way, but it also raised the question, if people 100 years ago knew these spots were dangerous, why didn't we? The answer, I realized, was simple. We'd forgotten. In our modern world, with our GPS and our radios and our helicopters, we'd convinced ourselves that we'd mapped every inch of these mountains, that we understood them. We'd stopped listening to the old stories, stopped paying attention to the warnings that had been passed down through generations. And people were paying for that arrogance with their lives. I started marking the dangerous zones on our trail maps. I couldn't tell other rangers why, couldn't explain about the fog and the thin places without sounding crazy. So I made up excuses. Increased bear activity, unstable terrain, anything to keep people away from those specific areas. It helped, a little. We went almost a year without a disappearance, but I knew it was only temporary. People would keep coming to the forest, would keep wanting to explore every corner of it. And eventually someone would be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was the following October, almost exactly 2 years after Cole Pritchard disappeared, when I finally saw it happen. I was hiking the Salmon Creek Trail, doing a routine patrol. It was early morning, about 7 a.m., and I was alone. The weather was clear, temperature in the 40s, a perfect fall day. I was approaching one of the zones I'd marked as dangerous, but I'd hiked through it dozens of times over the years without incident. That's when I saw him. A man, maybe in his 30s, wearing modern hiking gear, standing on the trail about 50 yards ahead of me. He had his back to me and seemed to be looking up at the trees, maybe watching for birds. "Morning," I called out. He didn't respond, didn't even turn around. I walked closer, starting to feel that familiar prickle of wrongness that I'd learned to associate with these places. "Sir?" I called again. "Everything okay?" That's when I noticed the temperature dropping. Rapidly. My breath started fogging in the air, and I could see frost forming on the pine needles around me. And then the fog came. It rolled in from all sides at once, like it had been waiting just out of sight. Thick, gray-white, moving with that same purposeful quality I'd seen before. It engulfed the hiker in seconds. I ran forward, shouting, "Get out of the fog! Move toward my voice!" But there was no response. The fog was so dense I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I kept moving forward, waving my arms, hoping to make contact with the hiker. My hand passed through something cold. Not air cold, but cold like ice. Cold that burned. I jerked my hand back and stumbled backward, getting out of the fog. And then it began to lift, rising straight up like it had that first time I'd seen it. Within seconds it was gone, dispersed into the clear morning air as if it had never been there. The hiker was gone too. I stood there, breathing hard, my hand throbbing where it had touched whatever was in that fog. The skin was red, like I'd been burned, but it was cold to the touch. I walked forward to where the hiker had been standing. His tracks were there in the dirt, showing him walking up the trail from the south. And then they ended, right at the spot where I'd last seen him before the fog engulfed him. But there was something else. Next to the final print, partially covered in dirt, was a cell phone. I picked it up carefully. It was still on, battery at 60%, and it showed the date. October 28, 2021. Today. The screen was unlocked. I looked at the last thing he'd been doing, taking a photo. I opened his gallery and looked at the most recent picture. It showed the forest trail taken from his perspective looking forward. The image was time-stamped 7:14 a.m., about 2 minutes before I'd seen him. But there was something in the photo, something that made my blood run cold. In the background, barely visible through the trees, was a structure. A small log cabin, rustic and old-looking. But I knew this section of trail. There was no cabin here. The nearest structure was a fire lookout tower almost 10 miles away. I looked up from the phone, looking at the same spot where the photo had been taken. Just trees. No cabin, no structure of any kind. I radioed it in, and within hours we had another search underway. We found the man's car parked at the trailhead. His name was Derek Paulson, a software engineer from Seattle who'd come for a day hike. We found his registration at the trailhead kiosk, showing he'd started hiking at 6:45 a.m. We searched for 3 days. Found nothing, of course, but I kept his phone. I shouldn't have. It was evidence, and it should have gone to the county sheriff. But I kept it, and I studied that last photo he took. I enhanced it, zoomed in, tried to see more details of that cabin that shouldn't exist. And then I noticed something else in the photo. In the woods behind the cabin, barely visible as a dark shape, was a person. Or the outline of a person. They seemed to be wearing old-fashioned clothes, and they appeared to be watching the trail. Watching for Derek Paulson? Or watching for anyone who might come through? I printed the photo and took it to Arthur Vance. He looked at it for a long time, then pointed at the cabin. "That's a trapper's cabin," he said. "The style, the construction, that's from the 1800s. My great-great-grandfather would have recognized it." "It's not there now," I said. "There's nothing at that spot but trees." "Not in our now," Arthur said quietly. "But maybe in somebody's now it's still there. Maybe that's where these people go. Not to death, but to some other place. Some other time that exists in the same place but separated from us. And they can't come back? I don't know. Maybe they can't find their way back. Or maybe the barrier doesn't work the same in both directions." He paused, looking troubled. "Or maybe some of them don't want to come back." That last thought haunted me. What if the people who disappeared weren't trapped? What if they'd found something on the other side that made them want to stay? I thought about Cole Pritchard, about Patricia Morales, about Sarah Kelton and Derek Paulson. Were they alive somewhere, in some version of this forest that existed in a different time? Were they trying to get back? Or had they made peace with where they were? I had no answers, just questions that multiplied the more I learned. After Derek Paulson's disappearance, I made a decision. I couldn't stop people from vanishing into these thin places, but I could at least document it properly. I started keeping detailed records of every incident, every observation, every piece of evidence. I compiled it all into a report that I knew no one in official channels would ever take seriously. But maybe someday, someone would. Maybe someday science would advance enough to explain what was happening in these mountains. Maybe we'd develop the technology to detect these thin places before people stumbled into them. Until then, all I could do was try to keep people safe. I continued marking the dangerous zones on maps, continued making excuses to keep people away from those specific areas. I taught the newer rangers to pay attention to sudden temperature drops, to unusual fog, to that feeling of wrongness that sometimes settled over parts of the forest. I didn't tell them why, just told them to trust their instincts. Some of them looked at me like I was being superstitious, but others, the ones who'd been in these mountains long enough, they understood. They'd felt it too, that sense that the forest was older and stranger than we liked to admit. 3 months after Derek Paulson disappeared, I was working late at the ranger station when I got a call from a hiker who'd seen something strange on the West Fork Trail. Usually these calls are about bears, or maybe a mountain lion, but something in this guy's voice made me pay attention. "There's someone out here," he said, "just standing in the middle of the trail. I tried talking to him, but he doesn't respond. He looks... I don't know how to describe it. He looks wrong." Wrong how? His clothes are weird, old-fashioned, and he's just standing there, not moving at all, staring at something I can't see. I felt my pulse quicken. "What's your exact location?" He gave me coordinates that placed him right in one of the zones I'd marked. I told him to back away, to keep his distance from the figure, and that I'd be there as soon as possible. I grabbed my gear and drove out there, making it to the trailhead in 20 minutes. Then I half-ran the 2 miles to the coordinates the hiker had given me. When I got there, he was waiting on the trail, looking shaken. "He's still here," the hiker said, pointing down the trail. "Same spot, hasn't moved." I looked where he was pointing and saw him. A man standing perfectly still about 30 yards ahead, facing away from us. He was wearing what looked like buckskin clothing and a fur hat, and he was indeed completely motionless. "Stay here," I told the hiker. Then I approached carefully. "Hello," I called out. "Sir, are you all right?" No response. I got closer, close enough to see details. His clothes were authentic, worn and weathered in a way that costume pieces never are. The fur of his hat looked like wolf, or maybe coyote, and he was so still he didn't even seem to be breathing. I was about 10 feet away when I noticed the temperature dropping, and then I saw it starting to form around him. That fog, beginning to materialize out of nowhere. "Sir," I shouted, "you need to move, now!" For the first time, the figure reacted. He turned his head slowly, and I saw his face. He looked confused, frightened even. His lips moved like he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. The fog was thickening rapidly now. I took a step toward him, some instinct telling me I needed to pull him out of it, to save him from whatever was about to happen. But as I reached toward him, he stepped back, shaking his head. And then he turned away and walked into the thickening fog, disappearing from sight. I stood at the edge of the fog, that same cold radiating from it that I'd felt before. Behind me, the hiker was calling out, asking what was happening, but I couldn't answer. I could only watch as the fog lifted as quickly as it had formed, rising into the air and dissipating. The man in buckskin was gone, but his tracks were there. I examined them closely. They showed him standing in one spot, then turning and taking several steps before they ended. The tracks were made by soft leather moccasins, nothing like modern shoes, and next to where he'd been standing, I found something else, a small animal trap, the kind trappers would have used 200 years ago. It was rusted and old, but fresh dirt clung to it like it had been set recently. I collected it carefully, photographed everything, and escorted the hiker back to his car. He kept asking me what he'd seen, who that man was. I told him I didn't know, which was technically true. I didn't know who that specific man was, but I knew what he was. Or rather, when he was from. He was someone from another time who'd stepped through into ours, probably just as confused and frightened as our people were when they stepped through into his time. Maybe he'd been checking his trap line in 1823 or 1845. walked into a patch of strange fog and found himself in a forest that looked the same but felt different. Found himself in our time. And then, when the fog came again, he'd stepped back through. Back to his own time. His own version of this forest. Back home. That incident changed how I thought about the whole phenomenon. It wasn't just about people disappearing from our time. It was about these places being shared across time. Points where different eras somehow intersected. Doors that could swing both ways. I wondered how often it happened. How many times had people from the past stepped briefly into our present, only to step back before anyone noticed? How many of our missing people had stumbled into the past and were living out their lives in an era that had ended a century ago? The questions haunted me, but they also gave me something I hadn't had before. Hope. If the barrier could be crossed in both directions, maybe it meant our missing people weren't lost forever. Maybe they were alive, somewhere and somewhen, living lives we couldn't see or touch, but that were nonetheless real. I kept working as a ranger for another 3 years after that. In that time, 2 more people disappeared in the same way, and I documented both incidents carefully. I also saw 3 more figures from other times, always briefly, always in those marked zones. Once it was a woman in pioneer dress, once a Native American man in traditional clothing, once what looked like a miner from the gold rush era. Each time, the fog came, and each time, they stepped back through it and disappeared. I retired last year. The official reason was that I wanted to spend more time with my family, pursue other interests. The real reason was that I couldn't take it anymore. Couldn't keep watching people disappear and being unable to do anything about it. Couldn't keep the secret that I knew these mountains held something unexplainable and potentially dangerous. But before I left, I compiled everything I'd learned into a comprehensive report. Every disappearance, every sighting, every piece of evidence. I included the maps showing the dangerous zones, the temperature readings, the photographs, everything. I gave it to Jack Forrester. He's still there, still keeping watch. He knows what to look for now, knows to pay attention to the warnings. And he's training the younger rangers the same way, passing on the knowledge even if he can't explain where it comes from. I also left a copy with Arthur Vance to be passed on to whoever in his family comes after him. The old knowledge needs to be preserved. Needs to be there for future generations, even if they don't believe it at first. Because the thing about the Bitterroots, about these mountains and forests that seem so familiar and mapped and understood, they're still wild in ways we can't comprehend. Still holding secrets that our science can't explain, still sheltering mysteries that existed long before we got here and will exist long after we're gone. I live in town now, about 50 miles from the forest. Sometimes, on foggy mornings, I look toward the mountains and wonder who might be stepping through at that moment. Who might be taking that final step that ends mid-stride, transitioning from one time to another without even realizing it until it's too late. And I think about Cole Pritchard, about where he might be now. Maybe he's alive in 1887, working as a ranch hand, telling stories about the strange experience he had in a fog-shrouded forest. Maybe he's in 1923, having found a new life as a logger. Or maybe he's even further back, living among people who've never heard of electricity or automobiles. I hope he's okay. Wherever and whenever he is, I hope all of them are okay. Because the truth is, they're not missing. Not really. They're just displaced. Lost in time, but not necessarily lost to time. The forest keeps them, holds them in some version of itself that exists beyond our ability to reach or understand. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would happen if I went back. If I walked into one of those zones, waited for the fog, and stepped through deliberately. Would I find them? Would I find all the missing people scattered across different eras, all trying to figure out what happened to them? It's tempting sometimes, the idea of solving the mystery by becoming part of it. But I'm not that brave, or maybe I'm not that foolish. So I stay here, in my time, in my small house in town. I keep the records, I keep the maps, and I keep watch for news of more disappearances. Because they'll keep happening. As long as those thin places exist, as long as the fog rolls in with its impossible cold and its strange purpose, people will keep stepping through. Some by accident, some perhaps drawn by something they don't even understand. The mountains don't care either way. The Bitterroots were here long before us, and they'll be here long after. They'll keep their secrets, keep their thin places, and keep accepting those who wander too far into their depths at the wrong moment. All we can do is respect that. Respect the fact that for all our technology and knowledge, there are still places in this world that operate by rules we don't understand. Places where the barrier between times grows thin, where the past and present and maybe even future all exist in the same geographic space, separated by nothing more than a wall of fog and a drop in temperature. I've told my story now, recorded it as honestly and completely as I can. I don't expect everyone to believe it. Hell, I'm not sure I would have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself, multiple times, over the course of years. But it's the truth. The Bitterroots have been taking people for as long as people have been walking through them. Sometimes they give people back, or at least let them pass through from other times. But more often, they keep them. And the tracks that end mid-stride, they're not signs of murder or animal attack or people choosing to disappear. They're signs of something far stranger. Thresholds crossed, times changed, lives displaced across the centuries. The next time you're hiking through deep wilderness, and you feel that sudden drop in temperature, see that fog rolling in from nowhere, feel that wrongness in the air, don't be curious. Don't investigate. Just turn around and leave as quickly as you can. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some doors, once you walk through them, don't let you come back. I learned that the hard way through 12 years of watching people vanish and being unable to stop it. I learned it through standing at those ending tracks, feeling the cold radiating from the ground, and knowing that someone had just stepped through a barrier I couldn't even see. The forest is beautiful, but it's also dangerous in ways most people never imagine. And in the Bitterroots, in those specific zones marked on my maps, the danger isn't from bears or cliffs or exposure. It's from the places where time wears thin. It's from the fog that moves with purpose. It's from the tracks that end mid-stride, leading nowhere and everywhere all at once. So if you ever find yourself in those mountains, on a trail that suddenly feels wrong, and you see fog rolling in when the weather says there shouldn't be any, run. Don't think about it. Don't try to understand it. Just run. Because the Bitterroots are patient. They've been taking their time with us for generations, and they'll continue doing so for generations to come. And once you step into that fog, once your tracks end mid-stride on some mountain trail, you won't be coming back. Not to this time, anyway. My name is Naomi, and I've been a park ranger in the Bitterroot National Forest for 8 years now. People always ask me if I've ever been scared out here, and for most of those 8 years I'd tell them no. Sure, I've had close calls with bears. I've been caught in lightning storms above tree line, and I've dealt with my share of aggressive or unstable visitors. But scared? Really, truly scared in a way that makes you question everything you think you know? That didn't happen until last September. It started with a routine call. Late afternoon on a Thursday, our dispatch received a report from a hiker who'd heard someone calling for help somewhere off the Clearwater Ridge Trail. The hiker, a guy named Mitchell, said he'd been hiking alone when he heard what sounded like a woman screaming for help. He tried to locate the source, calling out and listening, but he couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. After about 20 minutes of trying, he got spooked and hiked back to the trailhead to report it. I was paired with another ranger named Rory that day. Rory had been with the Forest Service for about 15 years, most of it spent in the Bitterroots, and he knew these mountains better than just about anyone. We grabbed our packs, radios, and first aid gear, and headed out to Clearwater Ridge. The Clearwater Ridge Trail is one of the more popular routes in our section of the forest. It's a moderate 6-mile loop that climbs through dense pine and fir forest before opening up to some spectacular ridgetop views. The trail is well maintained and clearly marked, not the kind of place where people usually get into trouble, but usually is a dangerous word in wilderness work. We started from the trailhead around 5 p.m., moving at a quick pace. Mitchell had marked the approximate location on his GPS where he'd heard the calls, about 3.5 miles in. The weather was perfect, clear skies, temperature in the mid-60s, with that particular quality of late afternoon light that makes the forest look almost golden. If we were going to search for someone, these were ideal conditions. "What do you think?" I asked Rory as we hiked. "Lost hiker? Injured?" He shrugged. "Could be anything. Maybe someone wandered off trail and got turned around, or took a fall and can't walk. We'll know when we get there." We reached Mitchell's marked location about 45 minutes later. It was a section of trail that ran along the eastern side of the ridge, with thick forest on both sides. The trail here was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, and the undergrowth was dense, mostly ferns and huckleberry bushes beneath the towering pines. We stopped and listened. The forest was doing its usual late afternoon thing. Birds calling, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant sound of a creek somewhere downslope. Nothing unusual. "Hello?" Rory called out, his voice carrying through the trees. "This is the Forest Service. If you need help, call out." We waited. Nothing. "Maybe they already got out," I suggested. "Found their way back to the trail." "Maybe," Rory said, but he didn't sound convinced. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called again. "If anyone can hear me, make some noise. We're here to help." And that's when we heard it. "Help! Please help me!" It was a woman's voice, high and panicked, exactly the kind of sound that triggers every rescue instinct you have. But there was something wrong with it. Something I couldn't quite identify in that first moment, but that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "There," I said, pointing downslope to our left, where the forest descended into a thick ravine. "She's down there!" But Rory was frowning, his head cocked to one side. "Hold on," he said quietly. "Help! Oh God, please help me!" The voice came again, and this time I heard what Rory had noticed. The sound was coming from downslope to our left, but something about the acoustics was wrong. It didn't sound distant and muffled like it should if someone was down in that ravine. It sounded close, almost like it was right next to us, but the direction was still clearly downslope. "That's weird," I said. Rory pulled out his compass and took a bearing on the sound. Then he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. A mix of confusion and something that might have been concern. "What?" I asked. "Take a bearing," he said, handing me his compass. "Tell me what direction that voice is coming from." I did, calling out to get the woman to respond again. "We hear you. Keep calling out so we can find you. Help me. Please, I'm hurt." The voice was desperate. Frightened, I took the bearing. 230 degrees, southwest, downslope into the ravine. I checked it twice to be sure. 230, I told Rory. He nodded grimly. "That's what I got." Now look at the terrain. I looked. The ravine ran northeast to southwest, carved by a seasonal creek that was probably dry this time of year. If someone was down there calling for help, the sound should be channeling up the ravine, which would make it seem like it was coming from either northeast or southwest along the ravine's length. But we were standing on the east side of the ravine, and the voice was clearly coming from the southwest, from the opposite side of the ravine, which meant the sound would have to travel down into the ravine, across the bottom, and then up the other side before reaching us. Sound doesn't work that way, especially not in a forested ravine. It should have been muffled, diffused, or we should have been hearing echoes. Instead, it sounded like someone was standing 10 feet away from us, but in a direction that made no acoustic sense. Maybe there's some weird echo effect, I suggested, but I didn't believe it even as I said it. "Help, please!" The voice came again, and this time I noticed something else. There was no variation in it. The same pitch, the same emotional intensity, like a recording being played back. "I don't like this," Rory said quietly. "Something's off." "We still have to check it out," I said. "If someone's actually hurt down there." "I know," he interrupted, "but we're going to be smart about it. We stay together, and we mark our route carefully. If anything feels wrong, we don't push it." We started making our way down into the ravine, using our trekking poles for stability on the steep slope. The forest here was thick, and we had to push through undergrowth that clawed at our clothes. Every few minutes, we'd stop and call out, and the voice would respond. But as we descended, the voice didn't get louder. It stayed at exactly the same volume, the same apparent distance. And it was still coming from the southwest, even though we were moving in that direction. "This doesn't make sense," I said after about 20 minutes of descent. "We should be getting closer." Rory stopped and turned to look back upslope. I followed his gaze and felt a chill run down my spine. We'd come down at least 200 vertical feet, but when I looked back at the trail, it seemed farther away than it should have been. The forest had closed in around us, the trees seeming taller and more densely packed than they had from above. "We need to mark this spot," Rory said, pulling out some bright orange flagging tape. He tied it to a tree branch at eye level. "And we need to take a GPS reading." He pulled out his GPS unit and waited for it to acquire a signal, and waited, and waited. "That's weird," he muttered. "I'm not getting a lock." "We're under pretty thick canopy," I said. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't that. I'd gotten GPS signals in much denser forests than this. "Help me, please. I can't move." The voice again, still from the southwest, still at the same distance. "Ma'am," Rory called out. "Can you see us? Can you see our flashlights?" He'd pulled out his high-powered LED flashlight and was waving it around. "Please help, I'm so scared." No answer to his question, just the same desperate plea. "I'm going to try something," Rory said. He pulled out his radio and keyed it up. "This is Ranger Hansen. Can anyone hear me?" Static. He tried different channels, more static. "We're not that deep in the ravine," I said. "We should be able to reach the repeater tower." "I know," Rory said grimly. "Naomi, I think we should head back up." "What? But if someone's actually—" "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I've worked in these mountains for 15 years. I've done dozens of rescues in terrain worse than this. And right now, every instinct I have is telling me that something is very wrong here. The sound isn't behaving right. Our GPS isn't working. Radio's not working. And that voice—" He paused. "Have you noticed it's saying the same things? The exact same phrases?" I had noticed, but I'd been trying not to think about it. trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. "Help! Oh God, please help me!" The voice came again, right on cue. "Same thing she said 10 minutes ago," Rory said. Word for word, same inflection. That's not how people in distress sound. There's no variation, no response to our calls, nothing. "So, what are you saying?" "It's a recording. Someone's messing with us. I don't know what I'm saying. But I know we need to get back to the trail, get back to where our gear works, and call this in. If there's really someone down here, we'll come back with a bigger team and better equipment." I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. Everything about this situation felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. We started making our way back up slope, following the orange flags Rory had tied. And that's when things got worse. We'd climbed for maybe 10 minutes when I realized the flags weren't where they should be. We should have been hitting one every 30 yards or so, but we'd gone at least 50 yards without seeing one. "Did we veer off course?" I asked. Rory stopped and looked around. "I don't think so. We've been climbing straight up, following the same general direction." "Help! Please help me!" The voice again, but now it was behind us. We'd been moving away from it, climbing back toward the trail, but now it sounded like it was upslope, in the direction we were heading. "That's not possible," I said. "I know," Rory said, and for the first time, I heard real fear in his voice. We kept climbing, faster now, our previous caution giving way to a growing sense of urgency. The forest seemed to be getting darker, though it was only around 6:30, and we should have had at least another hour of good daylight. "There," I said, pointing. "I see one of your flags." We scrambled over to it, and Rory examined it closely. Then he looked at me, his face pale. "This isn't my flag," he said. "What do you mean? It's the same orange tape. Look at how it's tied," he said, showing me. "I tie a specific knot, a clove hitch with a backup. This is just a simple overhand. This isn't my flag." We stood there in the growing darkness, staring at a piece of orange flagging that was exactly like the ones Rory carried, tied to a tree in the middle of the wilderness, but that he hadn't put there. "Someone else is out here," I said. But even as I said it, I knew how hollow it sounded. The odds of another ranger being in this exact spot, in this obscure part of the forest marking a route with the same type of tape we used, were essentially zero. "We need to keep moving," Rory said. "Forget the flags. We'll navigate by terrain. We go upslope until we hit the trail." We climbed. The forest pressed in around us, the trees seeming to grow closer together the higher we went. My legs were burning from the steep ascent, and I was breathing hard. But worse than the physical exertion was the growing sense of wrongness that permeated everything. The voice had stopped calling. The forest was silent in a way that wasn't natural. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the sound of our own labored breathing and the crunch of our boots on the forest floor. "Help me, please!" The voice came again, and this time it was ahead of us and to the right. We'd been moving away from it, but now it had somehow gotten in front of us again. "Ignore it," Rory said. "Just keep climbing." We climbed. My calves were screaming now, and I had to stop every few minutes to catch my breath. The darkness was deepening, and I pulled out my flashlight. The beam seemed weak, barely penetrating the shadows between the trees. And then, we saw them. Footprints in the soft earth. Boot prints, fresh ones. My stomach dropped as I recognized the tread pattern. They were ours. "We're going in circles," I said. Rory crouched down to examine the prints more closely. "No," he said slowly. "We're not. Look at the direction. These prints are heading downslope. We haven't been heading downslope since we started climbing back up." "Then whose prints are they?" He didn't answer. He just stood up and looked around, his hand resting on the can of bear spray at his belt. "Naomi," he said quietly. "I want you to take out your compass. Take a bearing upslope, the direction we've been heading." I did, my hands shaking slightly. The needle swung wildly for a moment, then settled. I read the bearing twice to make sure. "North-northwest," I said. "About 335 degrees." "That's not right," Rory said. He showed me his compass. It was reading south-southeast about 165 degrees. "Your compass must be broken," I said. "Check yours again." I did. It still read 335. "Help! Please help me!" The voice, closer now. Close enough that we should have been able to see whoever was calling. "We need to—" I started, but Rory held up his hand. "Listen," he whispered. I listened, and then I heard it. Beneath the woman's voice, so faint I'd almost missed it, was another sound, a humming, or maybe a buzzing, at a frequency that was almost below hearing. It made my teeth ache and my head feel fuzzy. "What is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," Rory said. "But I think we need to get out of here right now. Forget navigation, forget the trail. We just pick a direction and move fast." "Which direction?" He looked at his compass, then at mine, then at the darkening forest around us. "Downslope," he said finally. "We'll hit the creek at the bottom of the ravine, and creeks always lead somewhere. We can follow it out." It went against every bit of training we'd received. When you're lost, you're supposed to stay put, not wander deeper into wilderness. But nothing about this situation was following the normal rules. We started moving downslope, half running, half sliding on the steep terrain. The voice followed us, always seeming to come from a different direction, never quite catching up, but never falling behind either. "Help me. Please. I'm so scared. Oh God, help me. Please. I don't want to die out here." The phrases cycled through, repeating every few minutes. And underneath it all, that buzzing sound, getting louder as we descended. We'd been moving for maybe 20 minutes when Rory suddenly stopped. I almost crashed into him. "What?" I asked. He pointed ahead. Through the trees I could see a light. Not the natural light of sunset, but an artificial light, bright and steady. "A camp?" I suggested hopefully. "Maybe," Rory said, but he didn't sound hopeful. He sounded scared. We approached carefully. The light was coming from a small clearing about 50 yards ahead. As we got closer, I could make out more details. There was a tent, a fire ring, camping gear scattered around, and in the center of it all, a camp lantern, burning bright. But there was no one there. "Hello," I called out. "Is anyone here?" No answer except that damn voice, still calling from somewhere behind us. "Help me, please!" We walked into the camp. Everything was set up like someone was in the middle of using it. The tent was zipped shut, but looked occupied. I could see sleeping bags and gear inside through the mesh panels. The fire ring had fresh ashes, still warm when I held my hand over them. There was food sitting out on a camp table. An open bag of trail mix, a half-eaten energy bar, a water bottle with condensation still on it. "Someone was just here," I said. Rory was looking at something on the ground. "Naomi," he said, his voice tight. "Come look at this." I walked over. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, looking at the ground. There were footprints leading into the camp from the direction we'd come, and then more footprints leading out, heading deeper into the forest. But here's what made my blood run cold. The prints leading in were from boots. The prints leading out were barefoot. "What the hell?" I whispered. "Look how they're spaced," Rory said, pointing. "The boot prints are normal, regular stride length, but these—" He indicated the barefoot prints. "These are too far apart. Like whoever made them was taking steps that were 6, 7 feet long." I looked at the prints more closely. He was right. The barefoot prints showed someone walking, not running, but walking, with a stride that was impossibly long for a normal human gait. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now." "Agreed," Rory said. We turned to leave the camp, and that's when we saw her. A woman standing at the edge of the clearing about 20 yards away. She was wearing hiking clothes, jeans, a fleece jacket, boots. She looked normal, except for one thing. She wasn't moving. Not breathing, not shifting her weight, nothing. She stood perfectly still like a mannequin. "Ma'am?" Rory called out. "Are you all right?" The woman didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that we'd spoken. "Miss, we're park rangers," I said, taking a step toward her. "If you need help, help me," the woman said. But her mouth didn't move. The voice came from her direction, but her lips didn't form the words. "Please help me. I'm scared." It was the same voice we'd been hearing, coming from this woman who stood frozen at the edge of camp. "Oh God," I breathed. The woman's head turned toward us, not smoothly, like a normal person turning their head, but in a single smooth rotation, like someone had picked up her head and placed it facing a different direction. Her eyes were fixed and unblinking, reflecting the lantern light. "We're leaving," Rory said firmly. He grabbed my arm and pulled me back, away from the woman, keeping his eyes on her the whole time. We backed away from the camp, moving as quickly as we dared through the forest. The woman didn't follow, but I could feel her eyes on us until the trees blocked our line of sight. "What was that?" I asked once we were a safe distance away. "I don't know," Rory said. "But we need to get out of these woods, now." We kept moving downslope, operating on pure adrenaline now. The forest had become completely dark, our flashlights providing the only illumination. The buzzing sound was constant now, vibrating through my bones. And then we found the trail. Not the trail we'd been on originally, but a trail. It was narrow and overgrown, but it was clearly man-made, cutting through the forest in a relatively straight line. "Do you know this trail?" I asked Rory. He studied it with his flashlight, looking at the trees on either side. "No," he said slowly. "I've never seen this before, and I've hiked every maintained trail in this section of forest. Maybe it's an old trail? One that's not on the maps anymore?" "Maybe," he said. But he didn't sound convinced. We didn't have a lot of options. We were lost. Our equipment wasn't working, and following a trail, any trail, was better than stumbling through the forest in the dark. We started down the trail. It wound through the forest, climbing and descending over small rises and dips in the terrain. The buzzing sound faded somewhat, which I took as a good sign. We'd been walking for maybe 30 minutes when Rory stopped suddenly. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing ahead. I looked. There was something on the trail ahead of us, maybe 50 yards away. At first I thought it was a fallen tree, but as we got closer I realized it was a structure. Some kind of wooden frame or archway built across the trail. We approached cautiously. The structure was made from rough-cut logs lashed together with what looked like old rope. It formed an arch about 8 feet tall, spanning the width of the trail. Hanging from the arch were objects. I couldn't quite make them out in the flashlight beam. When we got close enough to see clearly, I wished we hadn't. The objects hanging from the arch were boots. Dozens of them, in various states of decay. Some looked relatively new, while others were ancient, the leather rotted and falling apart. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. Rory walked up to the arch and examined the boots more closely. He reached up and touched one, and it swung slightly on its cord. "These are old," he said. "Really old. Look at the style. These haven't been made in 50 years. He moved to another. "But this one's new. This is a modern hiking boot." I looked at the boots more carefully and felt my stomach turn. Each boot had something carved into the sole. Names, dates. Some were too worn to read, but others were clear. Martin Cross, July 1983. Jennifer Kim, September 1987. Thomas Burke, October 2015. These are people who went missing, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. These are the boots of people who disappeared in these mountains. Rory was staring at one boot in particular. I followed his gaze and saw what had caught his attention. The boot was newer than most of the others, the leather still relatively intact. Cole Pritchard, October 2019. Cole Pritchard. The name sounded familiar. And then I remembered. He was a hunter who'd gone missing in this forest about 2 years ago. They'd searched for days and never found any trace of him. "We need to go," Rory said, backing away from the arch. "We need to—" He was cut off by the sound of footsteps. Not on the trail ahead of us or behind us, but to our right, coming through the forest. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving in unison. We turned our flashlights toward the sound and saw them emerging from between the trees. People, 5 of them, walking in a single file line, moving with that same too-long stride we'd seen in the barefoot prints. They weren't looking at us, weren't looking at anything really. They just walked past us, crossed the trail, and disappeared into the forest on the other side. They were all barefoot, and none of them were wearing their boots. We stood frozen on that trail for a long moment after they disappeared. My mind was trying to process what I'd just seen, trying to fit it into some framework that made sense, and failing completely. "Did you see their faces?" I whispered. Rory nodded slowly. They looked wrong. Like masks, like someone had painted faces onto smooth wood. I had seen the same thing. The people, if they were people, had features that almost looked normal, but there was something fundamentally off about them. The proportions weren't quite right, the expressions too fixed, the eyes too glassy. "We can't go through the arch," I said. "Agreed," Rory said. "We go around, through the forest." We left the trail and pushed into the undergrowth, giving the arch a wide berth. The forest here was thick, and we had to fight our way through branches and bushes that seemed to grab at our clothes and packs. But I'd have gladly torn my way through a wall of thorns, rather than walk under that arch with its collection of boots. It took us 20 minutes to circle around and find the trail again on the other side. We stood there breathing hard, checking to make sure the arch wasn't visible behind us, and then continued down the trail. The buzzing sound had faded to almost nothing, which I hoped meant we were getting away from whatever was wrong with this part of the forest. My radio still wasn't working, and neither was my GPS, but at least we had a trail to follow. "When we get out of here," Rory said as we walked, "we're filing a report about all of this. Everything we saw. I don't care if they think we're crazy." "They will think we're crazy," I said. "I know, but there's something wrong in these mountains, Naomi. Something that needs to be documented and investigated properly. Those boots, those were real people who went missing. And that woman at the camp and those things walking through the forest, something's happening out here that isn't natural." I wanted to argue with him, to find some rational explanation for what we'd experienced, but I couldn't. I'd seen what I'd seen, and no amount of rationalization was going to make it make sense. We walked for another hour, following the trail as it wound through the forest. Gradually, the forest started to feel more normal. The trees weren't quite as dense, the darkness wasn't quite as oppressive. And then, finally, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. A car engine, distant but unmistakable. "Road," I said. "Thank God," Rory breathed. We picked up our pace, almost jogging now despite our exhaustion. The trail led us down a final steep section, and then suddenly dumped us out onto a forest service road. I'd never been so happy to see gravel and dirt in my life. We stood on that road, looking both ways, trying to figure out where we were. The road wasn't familiar, but that didn't matter. Roads led somewhere. We just needed to pick a direction and follow it. "Left," Rory said, pointing. "I think I see a vehicle." We walked toward it and found an old pickup truck parked on the shoulder. It was empty, but the engine was still warm. "Someone else is out here," I said. "Or was," Rory said grimly. He pulled out his radio and tried it again. This time, it crackled to life. "This is Ranger Hansen requesting immediate assistance. We have a potential emergency situation. Does anyone copy?" Static, then a voice. "Hansen, this is base. We read you. What's your location?" Rory looked around, trying to find a mile marker or landmark. "We're on a Forest Service road, but I'm not sure which one. Can you get a fix on my radio signal?" "Stand by." We waited, and I'd never been so happy to hear the scratchy sound of a radio static in my life. We were back in communication. We were going to be okay. "Hansen, we're getting your signal from Road 468, about 2 miles south of the Clearwater Trailhead. What's your emergency?" Rory and I looked at each other. Road 468 was on the completely opposite side of the ridge from where we'd started. We'd somehow ended up miles from where we should have been. "We need immediate extraction," Rory said into the radio. "We have critical information regarding the missing hiker report from earlier today, requesting pickup at our current location." "Copy that. Vehicle en route, ETA 30 minutes. We sat down on the tailgate of the abandoned pickup truck to wait. Now that we were out of the forest, now that we were back in radio contact and knew help was coming, the full weight of what we'd experienced started to sink in. "No one's going to believe us," I said. "I know," Rory said. "But we have to report it anyway. Those boots, if we could get back there, recover them, they'd be evidence. Proof that something strange is happening out there. If we could find it again," I said. "I'm not even sure where we were. Nothing about those coordinates or that terrain is going to match our maps." "We have to try," Rory said. He pulled out his GPS unit. It was working again, showing our current location. He started scrolling through the track log, looking at our route. And then he stopped, his face going pale. "What?" I asked. He showed me the screen. The track log showed us starting at the Clearwater Trailhead, hiking along the trail for about 3 miles, and then nothing. Our track just stopped. There was no record of us descending into the ravine, no record of the hours we'd spent wandering through the forest, no record of the trail we'd followed to get here. According to the GPS, we'd simply teleported from the middle of Clearwater Ridge Trail to Road 468, about 5 miles away. "That's not possible," I said. "Add it to the list," Rory said grimly. The ranger station truck arrived about 40 minutes later. 2 rangers I didn't know very well got out, looking concerned. "You guys okay?" one of them asked. "You look like you've been through hell." "Long story," Rory said. "We need to get back to the station and file a report immediately. It's important." They drove us back, asking questions about what had happened, but Rory and I stayed quiet. We needed to report this properly, to our supervisor, with everything documented. When we got back to the ranger station, we found our supervisor, Tom Marshall, waiting for us with a concerned expression. "I got your radio call," he said. "What happened out there?" We told him everything. The voice calling for help, the acoustic impossibilities, the equipment malfunctions, the camp with no people, the woman who stood frozen, the arch with the boots, the figures walking through the forest. All of it. Tom listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled as we talked. When we finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I want you both to understand," he said finally. that what you're describing sounds impossible. It sounds like the kind of thing that people who've been in the woods too long sometimes experience. Disorientation, hallucinations caused by dehydration or exhaustion. We weren't hallucinating, Rory said firmly. Both of us saw and heard the same things. Our equipment malfunctioned in verifiable ways, and there should be an abandoned camp out there, physical evidence of what we experienced. I believe that you believe what you saw, Tom said carefully, but I need you to consider the possibility that there might be a more mundane explanation. Environmental factors, equipment failure, stress. Check the missing persons reports, I said. The boots we saw had names and dates carved into them. Cole Pritchard, October 2019. If that matches a real missing person case, it does, Tom said quietly. Cole Pritchard was a hunter who disappeared from the Clearwater area in October 2019. They searched for 2 weeks and never found any trace of him. The three of us sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that confirmation hanging in the air. There were other names too, Rory said. Dozens of them, going back decades. If even a fraction of those are real missing person cases from this forest, then we have a pattern, Tom said, and a problem. He leaned back in his chair. Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to pull the missing person files for this area going back as far as our records go. You two are going to write up a detailed report of everything that happened today, with maps if possible showing your route. And tomorrow, if you're both up for it, we're going to organize a search team to try to find that camp and that arch. What about the voice? I asked. The woman calling for help? Someone reported hearing that, which is why we went out there in the first place. I'll follow up on that, Tom said. But right now, you two need to go home, get some rest, and try to process what you experienced. We'll tackle this fresh tomorrow. We left the station around 9 p.m. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying everything that had happened. When I got to my apartment, I sat down and tried to write out my report, but I found my hands were shaking too badly to type. I ended up calling Rory. Can't write it either? He asked when he picked up. No, I said. Every time I try, I keep thinking about those boots. About Cole Pritchard walking into that forest 2 years ago and never coming out. About all those other names, all those other people. I know, Rory said quietly. I can't stop thinking about the woman at the camp. The way her head turned. That wasn't human, Naomi. Whatever we saw out there, it wasn't human. Then what was it? I don't know. But I think there's something in those mountains. Something old. Something that's been there a long time. And I think it takes people. I wanted to tell him he was being ridiculous, that there had to be a rational explanation. But I couldn't, because deep down, I believed the same thing. What do we do? I asked. We go back tomorrow, Rory said. We find that camp, that arch, and we document everything. We take photos, we collect evidence, and we make it impossible for anyone to dismiss what we saw. And if we can't find it, if it's not there anymore, then we keep looking, Rory said. Because if we don't, more people are going to disappear, and we'll be the ones who could have done something and didn't. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing that voice in my head. Help me, please, I'm scared. Over and over, the same inflection, the same desperate plea. And I kept seeing those boots hanging from the arch, swaying gently in a breeze that shouldn't exist. The next morning, I met Rory and Tom at the ranger station at 7 a.m. Tom had assembled a small team. 4 rangers total, plus a couple of SAR volunteers who'd been briefed on what we were looking for. I pulled the missing person files, Tom told us before we headed out. Going back to 1970, which is as far back as our digital records go. I found 12 cases that match the time frame of the dates you saw on those boots. 12 people who disappeared in the Clearwater area over the past 50 years and were never found. 12, I said quietly. But there were way more boots than that. I know, Tom said, which either means you saw more than you remember, or some of those cases go back further than our records. Or, he trailed off. Or, there are more missing people than have been reported, Rory finished. We loaded up the vehicles and drove out to Clearwater Trailhead. The plan was to hike the route Rory and I had taken yesterday, trying to retrace our steps to the ravine where we'd first heard the voice. It was a beautiful morning, clear and cool, the kind of day that makes you remember why you became a ranger in the first place. But I felt nothing but dread as we started down the trail. We reached the spot where we'd first heard the voice calling for help. Everything looked normal, just a regular section of trail through regular forest. This is it, I said. This is where we were standing when we first heard her. Tom pulled out his radio. Everyone stay quiet for a minute, he said. Let's listen. We stood in silence for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, nothing. Just the normal sounds of the forest. Try calling out, Tom suggested. See if it responds. Hello, Rory called. Is anyone there? If you need help, call out. We waited, nothing. Let's head down into the ravine, Tom said. Show us where you went. We descended into the ravine, following the same route we'd taken the day before. Or at least trying to. Everything looked different in the daylight. The trees that had seemed ominous and crowded yesterday just looked like normal trees. The undergrowth that had grabbed at our clothes seemed less dense. This is where we found the boot prints, I said, pointing to a spot. There were tracks here, our tracks, but they were heading the wrong direction. Tom crouched down to examine the ground. I don't see any tracks, he said. The soil's too dry. We kept searching, moving deeper into the ravine. We looked for the camp, for the orange flagging tape Rory had tied, for any sign of what we'd experienced. But there was nothing. The ravine was just a ravine, no different from dozens of others in the forest. After 3 hours of searching, we climbed back up to the trail. It was here, Rory said, frustrated. I know it was here. The GPS showed. He pulled out his GPS unit and checked the track log. It shows nothing, but I know we were here. I believe you, Tom said. But there's no physical evidence. No camp, no flags, no unusual tracks. If something was here yesterday, it's gone now. What about the trail? I asked. The old overgrown trail we followed out? That has to be on a map somewhere. Tom pulled out a topographic map and spread it on the ground. He pointed to Road 468, where we'd emerged. If there was a trail leading to this road from the Clearwater area, it would be marked here. But look, there's nothing. No trail, no old logging road, nothing. Then how did we get there? I asked. We walked for hours on that trail. It was real. I remember every step. I don't know, Tom said. But I think we need to consider the possibility that what you experienced yesterday was anomalous, not normal, not something that's going to show up on maps or leave behind physical evidence we can find. We spent the rest of the day searching the area, expanding our search grid, looking for any sign of the camp or the arch. We found nothing. By evening, we had to admit defeat and head back to the ranger station. I'm not writing off your report, Tom said as we packed up. What you described is too specific, too detailed to be simple disorientation. But I also don't have an explanation for it, and without physical evidence, there's not much we can do. What about the missing persons? Rory asked. 12 people disappeared in this area. That's not normal. I looked into that, Tom said. And you're right. It's a higher rate than we'd expect for a forest of this size, but most of those cases have been investigated already. Accidents, getting lost, exposure, there are explanations, even if the bodies were never recovered. Or, I said, there's something in these mountains that takes people, and we've just been assuming it's natural causes because we couldn't imagine any other explanation. Tom was quiet for a long moment. Maybe, he said finally. But unless we can find evidence, unless we can figure out what's really happening out there, all we can do is be more vigilant. Watch for patterns, pay attention to reports of unusual occurrences, and try to keep people safe. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the only one we had. Over the next few weeks, I found myself becoming obsessed with the missing persons cases. I pulled every file I could access, looking for patterns, for commonalities. What I found was disturbing. Almost all of the disappearances in the Clearwater area had one thing in common. Someone heard a voice calling for help shortly before or around the time the person went missing. It wasn't always documented in the official reports. Sometimes it was just a note in the margin or a mention in witness statements that hadn't been followed up on. But it was there, over and over. A hiker disappeared in 1983. 2 days before, another hiker reported hearing someone calling for help in the same area but finding no one. A camper vanished in 97. Her tent was found intact, but other campers nearby reported hearing a woman screaming for help that night. A trail runner disappeared in 2015. A fellow runner reported hearing calls for help from the forest but thought it sounded wrong somehow and didn't investigate. The pattern was clear. The voice was a lure. Something in those mountains was using the sound of someone in distress to draw people in, to pull them off the trails and into what, I didn't know. But once they went in, they didn't come back. I showed my findings to Rory and he agreed with my assessment. "We need to warn people," he said. "Put up signs, issue alerts. If you hear someone calling for help in the Clearwater area, don't go alone. Call for ranger assistance first." We took our proposal to Tom, who looked troubled but agreed. "I can't officially sanction a warning based on what you're telling me," he said. "But I can issue a general safety advisory. Remind people to stay on marked trails, don't travel alone, that sort of thing. And I'll make sure our ranger patrols in that area are increased." It was something, at least. But the nightmares continued. I kept dreaming about those boots swaying from the arch. And in my dreams I could see my own boots among them, with my name and today's date carved into the sole. 3 months passed. Winter came to the Bitterroots, and the high country became largely inaccessible. The Clearwater area, with its lower elevation trails, still saw some use from winter hikers and cross-country skiers, but traffic was way down from the peak summer and fall seasons. I should have been relieved. Fewer people in that area meant fewer chances for someone to hear that voice, to follow it into whatever waited in those woods. But instead, I felt anxious, because I knew that whatever was out there wasn't seasonal. It didn't hibernate or migrate. It was always there, always waiting. In late February, we got a call that confirmed my fears. A cross-country skier had failed to return from a day trip in the Clearwater area. His car was found at the trailhead, his route plan filed properly, but he never came back. Search teams went out the next morning. They found his ski tracks, following them for about 4 miles before they simply stopped. No sign of the skier, no indication of what had happened. The tracks just ended in the middle of an open meadow. When I heard the report, my blood ran cold. "I'm going out there," I told Rory. "Naomi," he said carefully, "I don't think that's a good idea." "Someone needs to," I said. "Someone who knows what to look for, what to listen for. I'm not going to let another person disappear without at least trying to understand what's happening." "Then I'm coming with you," Rory said. We geared up and drove out to the Clearwater trailhead. It was a cold, gray day, temperature in the low 20s, with the kind of overcast sky that made everything look flat and colorless. We followed the ski tracks, moving quickly on our snowshoes. The tracks were clear in the fresh snow, 2 parallel lines from the skiers' classic cross-country technique. They led through the forest, following an old logging road that was used as a winter trail. 4 miles, Rory said, checking his GPS. That's where they said the tracks ended. We were quiet as we approached the location, both of us tense, watching the forest around us. The tracks continued ahead of us, clear and consistent, showing no sign of distress or deviation. And then we reached the spot. The tracks just stopped. One moment they were there, clear impressions in the snow showing someone skiing along at a steady pace. The next moment, nothing. Just undisturbed snow. Jesus, Rory breathed. I walked in a circle around the ending point looking for any sign of what might have happened. No other tracks, no marks in the snow, nothing. It was like the skier had simply been plucked out of existence mid-stride. "The voice," I said. He must have heard the voice. As if on cue, I heard it. "Help! Please! Someone help me!" It was faint, coming from the forest to our right. The same voice, the same desperate tone. "Do you hear that?" I asked Rory. He nodded, his face grim. "Same voice, exactly the same as last time. We need to try to track it," I said. "Figure out where it's actually coming from." "Are you sure about this?" Rory asked. "Last time we followed that voice, we almost didn't make it back." "Last time we were unprepared," I said. "This time, we know what we're dealing with. We stay together, we mark our route clearly, and the moment anything feels wrong, we turn back." Rory didn't look happy, but he nodded. We pulled out flagging tape and tied a bright orange strip to a tree at the point where the ski tracks ended. Then we started moving toward the source of the voice. "Help me! I'm hurt! Please!" The voice seemed to be coming from a thick stand of pines about 100 yards into the forest. We moved carefully, tying flags every 20 yards, making sure we could find our way back. As we got closer to the pines, I noticed the temperature dropping. Not just getting colder, dropping rapidly like we'd stepped into a freezer. "Rory," I said, "temperature." He checked his thermometer. 15 degrees, he said. It was 22 at the trail. We kept moving. The voice continued calling, but as before, it didn't get louder as we approached. It stayed at the same volume, the same distance. We entered the stand of pines, and I immediately felt that same sense of wrongness I'd felt 3 months ago. The air felt thick, the light seemed dimmer than it should be, and underneath everything was that faint, buzzing sound. "Help! Oh God, please help me!" "Where are you?" I called out. "Keep making noise so we can find you." No response except the same repeated plea for help. We pushed deeper into the pines, our snowshoes breaking through a thin crust of old snow, and then Rory stopped, grabbing my arm. "Look," he said, pointing ahead. Through the trees, I could see something. A structure, dark and irregular against the white snow. We approached cautiously. It was the arch. The same arch we'd seen 3 months ago, with its collection of boots hanging like grim ornaments. But now it was covered in snow and ice, the boots frozen in place, no longer swaying in the wind. "It's real," I whispered. "It's actually real." Rory was already taking photos documenting everything. I walked closer to the arch, looking at the boots. The same names I'd seen before were there. Cole Pritchard, Jennifer Kim, Thomas Burke. And now there were new ones. Michael Torres, February 2020. That was the skier, the one who'd disappeared just yesterday. His boot was already hanging from the arch, freshly carved with his name and date. "This is impossible," Rory said. "He disappeared yesterday. How is his boot already here?" "I don't think time works the same way in this place," I said. "Or maybe this arch exists outside of normal time. Maybe when someone disappears, their boot just appears here automatically." It sounded insane, but no more insane than anything else we'd experienced. "Help me! Please, I don't want to die!" The voice was louder now, and it was coming from beyond the arch, from whatever lay on the other side. "We should go back," Rory said. "We've got photos, we've got evidence. Let's get out of here and—" He was interrupted by a sound that made both of us freeze. Footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps, all walking in unison, crunching through the snow. They emerged from the trees to our right. 5 figures walking in single file, each taking those impossibly long strides. They were barefoot despite the snow, and their faces had that same mask-like quality I'd seen before. They walked toward the arch, not looking at us, not acknowledging our presence at all. As they got closer, I could see that one of them was wearing ski clothes, the missing skier. "Michael Torres?" I called out. "Are you okay?" He didn't respond, didn't even turn his head. He just walked with the others, his face blank, his eyes unfocused. They passed through the arch, one by one, and as each one crossed that threshold, they seemed to flicker, like a bad video signal, and then they were gone. "What the hell was that?" Rory breathed. "I think," I said slowly, "that's what happens to people who disappear. They become that, and they walk through the arch to wherever it leads." "We need to follow them," Rory said. "Are you insane?" I asked. "Didn't you just see what happened? They passed through and disappeared." "I know," Rory said. "But think about it, Naomi. We've been trying to figure out what's happening to these people. Well, here's our chance to find out. We know the arch is a threshold to somewhere. Maybe if we can cross it and come back, we'll finally have answers. Or maybe we'll end up like them," I said, blank-faced and walking in circles for eternity. "Maybe," Rory admitted. "But how many more people have to disappear before we do something? How many more boots have to hang from this arch?" I looked at the boots, at all those names and dates stretching back decades. He was right. We had to try. "Okay," I said. "But we tie ourselves together, and the moment anything feels wrong, we pull back." We had about 50 feet of rope in our packs. We tied one end around my waist, the other around Rory's, giving us about 25 feet of separation. Then we approached the arch. "Help me, please!" The voice was coming from beyond the arch now, clearer than it had ever been. "On 3, Rory said. 1, 2, 3. We stepped through the arch together. The world lurched. That's the only way I can describe it. It was like taking a step and finding that the ground was 6 inches lower than you expected. That moment of disorientation and imbalance. But it wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, spiritual. For a moment, I felt like I was being turned inside out, like every part of me was being examined and judged and found wanting. And then we were through. We stood on the other side of the arch, and the world was wrong. We were still in a forest, but it wasn't quite our forest. The trees were the same species, pines and firs, but they were taller, older, arranged in patterns that made my eyes hurt to look at. The snow was still there, but it was the wrong color, more gray than white. And the light? The light was all wrong. It came from everywhere and nowhere, casting no shadows. "Oh my God," Rory whispered. The 5 figures were standing about 30 yards ahead of us, still in their single file line. But they weren't moving anymore. They were just standing there, perfectly still, facing away from us. "Michael Torres," I called out. "Can you hear me?" Slowly, in perfect unison, all 5 figures turned to look at us. Their faces were even more wrong here, even more obviously not quite human. And their eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just solid black orbs that somehow still managed to convey awareness. They started walking toward us. "Back," Rory said urgently. "We need to go back." We turned and started toward the arch, but it wasn't there anymore. Where we'd just walked through was just more forest, more of those 2 tall trees arranged in their painful patterns. "Where is it?" I asked, panic rising in my voice. "Rory, where's the arch?" "I don't know." He was turning in circles, looking for any landmark. "It was right here. Help, please help me." The voice was all around us now, coming from every direction at once. And underneath it, that buzzing sound was louder, vibrating through my bones, making my teeth ache and my vision blur. The figures were getting closer, still walking in that too long stride, their black eyes fixed on us. "The rope," I said. "Follow the rope back. It should lead us to where we entered." We started following the rope, moving as quickly as we could through the strange snow. But the rope seemed to go on forever, much longer than the 50 feet we'd brought with us. It kept leading us deeper into this wrong forest, away from where we'd entered. "This isn't working," Rory said. "The rope is—" He was cut off by a scream. Not the recorded-sounding voice we'd been hearing, but a real scream, full of terror and pain. It came from ahead of us, from where the rope was leading. "Someone's here," I said. "Someone who's actually in trouble." "It's a trick," Rory said. "It has to be. Everything about this place is a trick." But the scream came again, and this time I could hear words. "Please, God, please, someone help me. They're coming." "That's real," I said. "Rory, that's a real person." We ran toward the sound, following the rope, the 5 figures now following behind us. We burst through a line of trees and found ourselves in a clearing, and in the center of the clearing was a woman. She was real, not like the blank-faced figures. She was wearing hiking clothes, and her face showed real emotion. Terror, desperation, exhaustion. She was backed up against a large boulder, and surrounding her were dozens of those figures, all standing perfectly still, all staring at her with their black eyes. "Help me!" she screamed when she saw us. "Please, you have to help me." "We're coming," I shouted. I started toward her, but Rory grabbed my arm. "Wait," he said. "Look at her boots." I looked. She was wearing hiking boots, modern ones, in good condition. She was real. She had to be real. But then I looked closer and saw what Rory had noticed. Her boots were clean. Not just relatively clean, but perfectly clean. No mud, no scuffs, no wear at all. Like they'd just come out of the box. And her clothes, which had looked rumpled and worn from a distance, were also pristine when I really looked at them. No dirt, no tears, no signs of someone who'd been running through the forest in terror. "It's not real," I whispered. "She's not real." As if responding to my realization, the woman's expression changed. The fear melted away, replaced by something that might have been disappointment. And then her face went slack, becoming mask-like, just like the others. "Help me," she said, but now her voice had that same recorded quality as the voice we'd been hearing. "Please help me." The figures all around her started moving, walking toward us in their synchronized stride. "Run," Rory said. We ran. We crashed through the forest, the rope still connecting us, the buzzing sound getting louder and louder. Behind us, I could hear dozens of footsteps, all moving in perfect unison, all following us. "The arch has to be here somewhere," I shouted. "It has to—" And then I saw it. Just ahead, standing among the two tall trees, was the arch. The same arch we'd walked through, with its collection of boots. We ran for it, the footsteps behind us getting closer. I could feel breath on the back of my neck, cold and wrong, and I knew that if I looked back, I'd see those black eyes right behind me. We hit the arch at full speed, and that lurching sensation happened again, but stronger this time. I felt like I was being pulled apart and put back together, every cell in my body screaming in protest. And then we were through. We collapsed in the snow on the other side, gasping for breath. The forest around us was normal again, our forest with its normal trees and normal light. The buzzing sound was gone. The footsteps were gone. "Did we make it?" I asked. "I think so," Rory said. He stood up shakily and looked back at the arch. "But Naomi, look." I turned to look. There was a new boot hanging from the arch. A modern snowshoe boot with fresh carving on the sole. "Naomi Cross, February 20. My name, today's date." "But I'm here," I said. "I made it back. I'm here." "I know," Rory said quietly. He pointed to another new boot hanging right next to mine. "Rory Hansen, February 2020. We stood there in the snow, staring at our boots hanging from that impossible arch. We'd made it back. We were here, alive, real. But according to the arch, according to whatever force controlled this place, we'd also been taken. "What does this mean?" I asked. "I don't know," Rory said. "But I think we need to leave right now." We followed our flagging tape back to the point where the ski tracks ended. The tracks were still there, still ending in the middle of nowhere. But now I knew what had happened to Michael Torres. He'd heard that voice, followed it, walked through the arch, and now he was one of those things, one of those blank-faced figures walking in eternal circles on the other side. And according to the arch, so were we. We hiked back to the trailhead in silence. When we got there, Tom Marshall was waiting with a search team. "Thank God," he said when he saw us. "You've been gone for 6 hours. We are about to send in a team to look for you." "6 hours?" Rory asked. "We were only gone for maybe 2 hours." Tom showed us his watch. It was nearly 5 p.m. We'd left at 11 in the morning. Somewhere, somehow, we'd lost 4 hours. We told Tom everything we'd seen. The arch, the boots with our names on them, the figures, the impossible forest on the other side. He listened with a troubled expression. "You need to see a doctor," he said when we finished. "Both of you. Dehydration, exhaustion, altitude sickness, any of those could cause hallucinations." "We both had the same hallucinations?" I asked. "Both saw the same impossible things? That's not how hallucinations work." "I don't know what else to tell you," Tom said. "Because what you're describing is impossible." "Take us back there," Rory said. "Right now. We'll show you the arch." But when we went back, when we retraced our route to the stand of pines where the arch had been, there was nothing there, just trees and snow. No arch, no boots, no evidence that anything unusual had ever been there. "It was here," I said, my voice breaking. "I swear to God it was right here." "I believe you," Tom said, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "But there's nothing here now. We were put on administrative leave for a week, ordered to see a counselor, and strongly encouraged to take some time off." The official story was that we'd experienced a stress-related episode brought on by our previous unexplained experience in the Clearwater area. But I knew the truth. We'd crossed through to the other side. We'd seen where the missing people go. And according to the arch, according to whatever rules governed that place, we'd been taken too. I just didn't know what that meant for us. Over the following weeks, I started noticing things. Small things at first. I'd be walking through the forest on patrol, and I'd hear that buzzing sound, faint and distant. Or I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, and when I turned to look, there'd be nothing there. Rory was experiencing the same things. "I think we brought something back with us," he told me one day. "Or maybe we left something behind." "What do you mean?" "That arch had our boots on it," he said. "Our names, today's date. Maybe part of us is still there. Maybe that's why we can hear the buzzing, why we can see things that shouldn't be there." It was a terrifying thought, but it made sense in a horrible way. And then, a month after our experience at the arch, it happened. I was at home, getting ready for bed, when I heard it. "Help! Please help me!" But it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from my bedroom mirror. I walked over and looked at my reflection. Everything looked normal at first. But then I noticed that my reflection's eyes were wrong. They were darker than they should be, the pupils too large. And as I watched, my reflection's mouth opened, and that voice came out again. "Help me! Please! I'm scared!" But my mouth didn't move. I stumbled back from the mirror, my heart pounding. When I looked again, my reflection was normal, just me, looking terrified. I called Rory immediately. "It's happening," I said. "I saw myself in the mirror, and I was one of them," he finished. "I know. I saw it too, in my bathroom mirror, about an hour ago." "What's happening to us?" "I think," Rory said slowly, "that we exist in both places now, here and there. We made it back physically, but something of us stayed on the other side. Or maybe something of the other side came back with us. Can we fix it? Can we undo it?" "I don't know," he said, "but I think we need to try." The next day, we went back to the Clearwater area, back to where the arch had been. It still wasn't there, but I could feel it. That buzzing sound was stronger here, and the air had that same thick quality it had on the other side. "It's here," I said. "We just can't see it." "Then we make it visible," Rory said. He pulled out a can of spray paint from his pack. "If it's here, if it's real, then this should hit it." He started spraying paint in an arc where we remembered the arch being. For a moment, nothing happened, but then the paint seemed to stick to something invisible, outlining the shape of the arch's left post. "It's working," I said. We spent the next hour spray painting the arch, making it visible. The boots appeared as we painted, hanging from the crossbar. All those names, all those dates, including ours. When we were done, the arch stood before us, as solid and real as it had been before. "Now what?" I asked. "Now we go through again," Rory said. "But this time we go prepared, and this time we're going to find a way to close this thing permanently." "How?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I know we can't leave it here. It's taken too many people already. It took Michael Torres. It almost took us. We have to end this." I wanted to argue, to say there had to be another way, but deep down, I knew he was right. The arch was a doorway to somewhere terrible, and as long as it existed, people would keep disappearing. "Okay," I said, "but not today. We need to prepare, plan, gather supplies. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." We spent the next week planning. We gathered equipment, researched folklore about thresholds and doorways, talked to anyone who might have knowledge of the paranormal. Most people thought we were crazy, but a few took us seriously. An anthropology professor told us about indigenous stories of thin places in the forest, where the boundary between worlds grew weak. A folklore specialist mentioned European legends of fairy rings and gates to the underworld. A physicist talked about the theoretical possibility of overlapping dimensions. None of it gave us a clear answer, but it all pointed to the same thing. The arch was a liminal space, a boundary between our reality and something else. And if we wanted to close it, we needed to do something at that boundary, something to seal it permanently. In the end, we decided on fire. Fire was purifying, transformative, and it had symbolic power in almost every culture. If we could burn the arch, maybe we could close the doorway. We returned to the Clearwater area on a cold morning in early March. We brought gasoline, accelerant, and everything we'd need to create a controlled burn. The arch was still there, visible now that we'd painted it, with all its boots hanging like a grim reminder of what we were fighting against. "Last chance to turn back," Rory said. "No turning back," I replied. "Let's end this." We soaked the arch in gasoline, making sure to cover every part of it. As we worked, I could hear that voice again. "Help me, please." But I didn't let it distract me. I knew now what it was, a lure, a trap designed to draw people in. I wasn't going to fall for it again. When everything was ready, Rory pulled out a lighter. "Together?" he asked. "Together," I agreed. We lit the arch simultaneously, tossing lit rags onto the gasoline-soaked wood. The flames caught immediately, roaring up in a column of fire that seemed impossibly hot for wood that should have been damp from snow. The boots began to burn, blackening and curling. And as they burned, I heard something. Voices, dozens of them, all crying out at once. Not the recorded-sounding pleas for help, but real voices, expressing real pain and fear. "What's happening?" I shouted over the roar of flames. "I think the people," Rory shouted back. "The ones who were taken. I think they're connected to the boots somehow. When the boots burn," the voices were getting louder, more anguished. And then, through the flames, I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, emerging from the burning arch. But these weren't the blank-faced things we'd seen before. These were people, real people, translucent and ghostly, but recognizable as human. And they were screaming. "We're hurting them," I said. "Rory, we're hurting them." "Or we're freeing them," he said. "Look." He was right. As the figures emerged from the flames, they didn't stay together. They scattered, drifting up into the air like smoke, their screams fading into something that sounded almost like relief. Like release. The arch burned for nearly 20 minutes. When the flames finally died down, all that was left was a pile of ash and some charred metal from the boot eyelets. The doorway was gone. The buzzing sound was gone too. The forest felt normal again, just regular trees and regular snow and regular light. "Is it over?" I asked. Rory checked his GPS. It was working perfectly. He tried his radio. Clear signal. "I think so," he said. We stood there for a long time, looking at the remains of the arch. 50 years' worth of missing people, maybe more, their boots burned to nothing. Had we freed them, killed them? I didn't know. "We should go," Rory said finally, "before anyone sees the burn site and asks questions." We hiked back to the trailhead, both of us exhausted and drained. When we got back to civilization, back to the ranger station and our normal lives, everything felt different. Lighter somehow. Like a weight had been lifted. Over the next few months, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Kept waiting for the buzzing to come back, for glimpses of those figures, for my reflection to go wrong again. But none of it happened. The forest was just a forest again. And most tellingly, no one else disappeared from the Clearwater area. I still work as a ranger in the Bitterroot National Forest. So does Rory. We never filed an official report about what happened with the arch. Who would believe it? But we both know the truth. For years, maybe decades, there was something in these mountains that took people. A doorway to somewhere terrible. Somewhere wrong. And we closed it. Sometimes I wonder about the people who were taken, the ones whose boots burned in that fire. Were they freed? Did they move on to wherever people go after death? Or did we snuff them out completely, ending whatever strange half-existence they had on the other side of that arch? I don't know. I'll probably never know. But I do know this. If you're ever hiking in the wilderness and you hear someone calling for help, be careful. Make sure you can see them before you go to their aid. Because sometimes the voice calling from the forest isn't a person at all. Sometimes it's something much worse. My name is Iris, and I've been a park ranger in the Bitterroot National Forest for 6 years. In that time, I've learned to trust 3 things absolutely: my compass, my map, and my ability to read terrain. Those 3 things have kept me safe through countless searches, rescues, and solo patrols in some of the most remote wilderness in Montana. But last October, all 3 of those things failed me in ways I still don't fully understand. It started with a missing hiker named David Ortega, 42 years old, experienced backpacker, solo trip planned for 5 days in the northern section of the forest. He'd filed his route plan properly, checked in with us at the ranger station before heading out, and seemed well prepared. When he didn't emerge at his scheduled time and his emergency contact couldn't reach him by sat phone, we initiated a search. I was paired with another ranger named Parker for the operation. Parker had been with the Forest Service for about 10 years, mostly in the Rockies, before transferring to the Bitterroots 2 years ago. He was methodical, careful, and had a reputation for finding people when other searchers had given up. If anyone could locate David Ortega, it would be Parker. We started from the trailhead at Crystal Lake, following David's planned route into the backcountry. It was early October, that transition time when fall is giving way to winter in the high country. The aspens had already lost most of their leaves, and there was frost on the ground each morning. Perfect weather for hiking, but also the kind of weather where a simple mistake could turn deadly if you got injured or lost. He planned to camp at Moose Meadow the first night, Parker said, studying the route plan. Then up to Red Ridge, across to Twin Lakes, and back out via the Northern Loop. 5 days, about 45 miles total. When did he check in last? I asked. Day 2 from Red Ridge. Sent a text via his sat phone saying he was on schedule and the weather was holding. That was 6 days ago. He should have been out 2 days ago. We made good time along the trail, calling out David's name every few minutes and watching for any sign of him or his camp. The trail to Moose Meadow was well maintained and easy to follow, winding through stands of pine and fir before opening up to the meadow itself. We found his first camp without much trouble. The fire ring still had charred wood, and we could see where his tent had been pitched in the grass. But David was long gone from here, presumably having moved on to Red Ridge as planned. "Let's keep moving," Parker said. "We can make Red Ridge by nightfall if we push." The trail from Moose Meadow to Red Ridge was tougher, climbing about 2,000 vertical feet over the course of 4 miles. It was a grunt of a hike, the kind that makes your calves burn and your lungs work hard, but it was still well marked and straightforward. We reached Red Ridge just as the sun was starting to set, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple. The ridge lived up to its name, exposed red rock jutting up from the forest, offering spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. There were a few established camping spots here, flat areas among the rocks where backpackers could pitch tents. We checked each spot methodically. At the third one, we found evidence of recent use. A fire ring with relatively fresh ashes, some disturbed ground where a tent had been, and, most tellingly, a protein bar wrapper that matched the brand we knew David carried. "He was here," I said, picking up the wrapper, "probably 3 or 4 days ago." Parker was examining the campsite more closely. "Look at this," he said, pointing to some marks on the ground near the fire ring. "These are boot prints, recent ones." I crouched down to look. He was right. There were clear impressions of hiking boot treads in the soft dirt near the fire. "Could be David's," I said. "Could be," Parker agreed. "But look at the pattern. These prints are all clustered right here, around the fire ring, like he was pacing back and forth. And look," he pointed to a deeper impression. "That's the print of someone who stopped suddenly, stood in one spot for a while." "Maybe he was thinking about his route, checking his map." "Maybe," Parker said, but he didn't sound convinced. He stood up and looked around the campsite. According to his route plan, he should have left here on day 3 and headed for Twin Lakes. That's about 6 miles northwest. We tried his sat phone number, but it went straight to voicemail. Either the phone was dead, turned off, or somewhere without signal, which was unlikely, given that we were on an exposed ridge. "We're losing daylight," I said. "Should we camp here and start fresh in the morning?" Parker checked his watch. "Yeah, let's set up camp, get some rest, and head for Twin Lakes at first light." If he stuck to his plan, that's where he'd be. We pitched our tents in one of the other flat spots on the ridge, about 50 yards from where David had camped. I always feel a little uneasy camping in spots where missing people were last seen, but it was the most practical option. We had good visibility, easy access to water from a small spring nearby, and we could continue the search from here in the morning. As we set up camp and made dinner, I noticed something odd. The forest around us was quiet. Not peacefully quiet, unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees, just silence, broken only by our own movements and voices. "You notice how quiet it is?" I asked Parker as we ate. He looked up from his camp stove. "Yeah, I noticed about an hour ago. Thought maybe it was just the time of day, but it's too quiet." We finished eating in that eerie silence, cleaned up our cooking gear, and prepared for the night. The temperature was already dropping fast, and I could see my breath in the beam of my headlamp. "I'm going to mark our route for tomorrow," I said, pulling out some orange flagging tape. "That way, if we need to backtrack or if another search team comes through, they'll know which way we went." I walked the perimeter of our camp, tying bright orange strips of flagging tape to trees at eye level, roughly 20 yards apart. I made sure each one was tied with a specific knot, a double overhand with a twist, that I'd been using for years. It was distinctive, and it meant that if I saw one of my flags, I'd know immediately that I was the one who'd placed it. As I worked, I kept detailed notes in my field book. Flag 1. Large pine, due north of camp, 6:47 p.m. Flag 2. Fir tree, northeast, 6:49 p.m. And so on. It was standard practice, the kind of careful documentation that had served me well in dozens of searches. By the time I finished, it was full dark. I returned to camp where Parker had gotten a fire going, small and controlled, just enough for warmth and light. 11 flags, I told him, showing him my notes, marking a complete circle around camp, each one visible from the next. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow, we'll head northwest toward Twin Lakes. If we don't find any sign of David by midday, we'll have to call in additional teams." We sat by the fire for a while, not talking much, both of us listening to that oppressive silence. Eventually, we retreated to our tents. I set my alarm for 6 a.m., lay down in my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. There was something wrong about this place. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't anything specific, no strange sounds, no unusual smells, just a feeling. a sense that we were being watched, or that the forest around us was somehow holding its breath. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke suddenly to my alarm beeping. 6 a.m., still dark outside, but I could see the first gray light of dawn beginning to filter through my tent fabric. I dressed quickly in the cold, crawled out of my tent, and immediately felt that something was off. The air felt different, thicker somehow, and there was a faint smell I couldn't identify, something metallic and sharp. Parker emerged from his tent a few minutes later. "Sleep okay?" he asked. "Not really," I admitted. "You?" "Same. Kept waking up, feeling like I was hearing something. But every time I listened, there was nothing." We made breakfast, instant oatmeal and coffee, and as the sun came up, we started preparing for the day's search. That's when I decided to do a quick check of my trail markers before we left camp. I walked to where I'd placed Flag 1 the night before, the large pine tree due north of camp. The flag was there, orange and bright in the early morning light, tied with my distinctive double overhand knot. But it was pointing the wrong direction. I'd tied it facing south, back toward camp, so that if someone was following my markers, they'd know they were heading toward our established position. But now it was facing north, away from camp. I checked my compass to be sure. Yes, camp was definitely due south. The flag should be pointing south, but it was pointing north. "That's weird," I muttered, and headed to Flag 2. It was also pointing the wrong direction. In fact, as I checked each flag in sequence, I found that every single one had been turned around. They were all still there, still tied with my knots, still on the same trees I'd marked in my field book. But they were all facing outward now, away from camp, instead of inward toward it. I hurried back to camp where Parker was packing his gear. "Parker," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Something's wrong with the flags." "Wrong how?" "They're all backwards. I tied them facing toward camp, but now they're all facing away." He frowned. Could the wind have spun them around? All of them? In exactly the opposite direction. And there wasn't any wind last night. You noticed how still it was. We walked the perimeter together, checking each flag. Every one was reversed. And not just reversed. They were tied exactly as they had been, with the same knots, at the same height, on the same trees. Someone or something had carefully untied each one, turned it 180 degrees, and retied it in exactly the same way. "Could you have tied them backwards without realizing?" Parker asked. I pulled out my field book. According to my notes, I was very specific about the direction. And I remember doing it. I remember standing at each tree and making sure the flag faced toward camp. "Then someone came through here last night," Parker said. "Someone who found your flags and turned them all around. But why? And how did they do it so precisely?" "Look," I showed him Flag 3. "This is tied with the exact same knot I use, at the exact same height. It's not like someone just spun the flag around while it was still tied. They untied it, turned it, and retied it." Parker was silent for a long moment, studying the flag. Maybe another search team? Someone trying to mark the route they came from? We would have been contacted if another team was in the area, and they'd use their own flagging, not modify ours. Then what's your explanation? I didn't have one. We stood there in the growing daylight looking at those backwards flags, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "We need to get moving," Parker said finally. "If David's still out here, we need to find him. We can worry about the flags later." We broke camp and started northwest toward Twin Lakes, following the trail that David should have taken. As we hiked, I kept looking back at those flags, visible on the ridgeline behind us, all pointing the wrong way. The trail descended from Red Ridge into a dense section of forest, the kind of place where the canopy is so thick that even at midday it feels like twilight. Our boots made soft sounds on the needle-covered path, and occasionally we'd stop to call out David's name. About 2 hours into our hike, Parker's GPS started acting strange. "That's odd," he said, stopping to look at the screen. "It's showing we're moving in a circle." "What do you mean?" He showed me the GPS track. According to the device, we'd been walking for 2 hours, but our track showed us moving in a rough circle, never getting more than half a mile from our starting point. "That can't be right," I said. "We've been walking in a straight line northwest. I've been checking my compass every 15 minutes. Parker checked his own compass, then looked at the GPS again. "Compasses says northwest. GPS says we've been going in circles." "Could the GPS be malfunctioning?" "It's possible, but this is a good unit. Military grade. I've used it in the Rockies for years without a problem." We kept walking, but now we were both checking our compasses constantly. They both consistently showed us heading northwest, but Parker's GPS continued to show us moving in circular patterns, sometimes even showing us backtracking over ground we'd supposedly already covered. After another hour, we should have been close to Twin Lakes, but there was no sign of the lakes, no change in terrain that suggested we were getting close. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "We should be there by now." Parker pulled out his paper map and compass, taking a careful bearing. According to this, Twin Lakes should be about half a mile northwest. We should be seeing them any minute. We pressed on, moving through the forest, pushing through undergrowth, watching for any sign of the lakes or David's trail. But after another 30 minutes, we still hadn't found them. "Stop," Parker said suddenly. "Look at this tree." He was pointing to a large fir tree with distinctive scarring on its trunk. 3 parallel gashes, probably from a bear's claws. I'd noticed the same tree about an hour ago. "We've been here before," I said. "According to my compass, we've been heading northwest the whole time," Parker said. "But we're walking in circles." I pulled out my own GPS and turned it on. It took a moment to acquire satellites, but when it did, it showed our position exactly where Parker's GPS said we were. About half a mile from Red Ridge, having moved in a series of circles and loops that made no sense given our careful navigation. "This is impossible," I said. "Both compasses, both GPS units, all showing the same thing, but we've been walking northwest. I'm sure of it." "Are you?" Parker asked quietly. "Are you absolutely sure?" I wanted to say yes, but the truth was, I wasn't. I'd been following my compass, yes, but in dense forest with limited visibility, it's easy to drift off course without realizing it. Maybe I'd been misreading the compass. Maybe I'd been distracted and hadn't been checking it as often as I thought. "Let's try something different," Parker said. "We'll use a more precise method. I'll take a bearing on that distinctive rock formation." He pointed to a small cliff face visible through the trees to our northwest. "And we'll walk directly toward it. No deviation. If we can reach that rock, we'll know we're actually moving in the direction we think we are." It was a good plan. The rock formation was clearly visible, maybe quarter-mile away. We took our bearings, confirmed we were both seeing the same target, and started walking toward it. We walked for 15 minutes, keeping our eyes on the cliff face the whole time. It never seemed to get any closer, but it also never disappeared from view. We were definitely moving toward it. And then we saw the tree. The same fir tree with 3 bare claw marks. "No," I said. "No, that's not possible. We've been walking in a straight line toward that rock. I've been watching it the entire time." Parker walked over to the tree and examined the marks. "Same tree. I'm sure of it. Look, there's even the chunk of bark missing here where it was partially torn away." We stood there, both of us staring at that tree, trying to make sense of what was happening. We'd walked in a straight line toward a visible landmark, never taking our eyes off it, and somehow we'd ended up back where we started. Something is wrong with this area, I said. The terrain, the magnetic field, something. Our instruments are all malfunctioning. All of them? Parker asked. 2 GPS units, 2 compasses, and both of our perceptions? That's a lot of simultaneous failure. Then, what's your explanation? He didn't have one. We tried again, this time walking south, back the way we'd come, hoping to return to Red Ridge where we knew the terrain and could regroup. But after 30 minutes of walking, we came to another familiar landmark, a lightning-struck pine that had split down the middle and fallen to form a distinctive V shape. I'd seen that tree too, earlier in our wandering. We weren't making progress south. We weren't making progress in any direction. We're trapped, I said, the words tasting bitter. We're stuck in some kind of loop, walking in circles without realizing it. Parker pulled out his radio. Let's call this in, get some help out here. He keyed up the radio. This is Ranger Parker, requesting assistance. He stopped, looking at the radio. It's not transmitting. I'm getting no response, not even static. I tried my radio, same result, dead air. Okay, I said, trying to stay calm. Okay, let's think about this logically. We're in a remote area. Cell phones don't work here, that's normal. Radios might not work because of terrain interference. GPS could be affected by solar activity or atmospheric conditions. Compasses can be thrown off by local magnetic deposits in the rock. And all of this is happening at exactly the same time? Parker asked. It's possible, I said, but I didn't believe it. We set up a temporary camp at the lightning-struck pine, deciding that moving around was only getting us more confused. At least if we stayed in one spot, we could think clearly and plan our next move. As we set up our tents, I noticed something else strange. The forest around us was still silent, just as it had been the night before. But now, in daylight, I could see why. There were no animals, no birds in the trees, no squirrels, no insects. The forest was completely devoid of life except for the trees themselves. Parker, I said, where are all the animals? He looked around, and I could see the realization dawning on his face. I don't know. This time of year, these woods should be full of activity. Birds migrating, bears fattening up before hibernation, elk moving to lower elevations. But there's nothing. It's like every animal in a square mile has left. Or is avoiding this area, Parker said quietly. We spent the rest of the afternoon trying different navigation techniques. We used the sun's position to determine direction. We created ranging poles and tried to walk in perfectly straight lines. We marked trees with chalk to track our movements. Nothing worked. Every attempt to move in a consistent direction ended with us back at a familiar landmark, having apparently walked in circles despite our best efforts to go straight. As the sun started to set, we gave up and retreated to our camp at the lightning-struck pine. We'll try again tomorrow, Parker said. Maybe it's something about the time of day or the atmospheric conditions. Maybe tomorrow will be different. But I didn't think tomorrow would be different. Something was fundamentally wrong with this section of forest. Something that was warping our ability to navigate. And somewhere out there, David Ortega was dealing with the same problem. If he was even still alive, that night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, listening to the silence, thinking about those backwards flags. Someone or something had turned them all around while we slept. Was someone doing this deliberately? Sabotaging our navigation, turning our markers, creating some kind of massive disorientation effect. But who? And why? And how were they affecting our GPS units and compasses? Around midnight I heard something. A sound, faint but distinct. cutting through the silence. Footsteps. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, listening. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush somewhere near our camp. They didn't sound like an animal. They had the rhythm and weight of a human walking. "Parker," I whispered. "Are you awake?" No response from his tent. The footsteps continued, circling our camp. I could hear them moving from north to south, then west, then back around to the north, walking in a circle around us, just beyond the range of visibility. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but something stopped me. Something about the deliberate, methodical way those footsteps moved made me deeply uneasy. After about 10 minutes, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, even more oppressive than before. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. When dawn came, I crawled out of my tent exhausted and shaky. Parker was already awake, sitting by a small camp stove making coffee. "You hear anything last night?" I asked. "Like what?" "Footsteps, walking around the camp." He looked at me sharply. "No, when?" "Around midnight. Someone was circling our camp for about 10 minutes, then stopped." "I didn't hear anything," Parker said. "But I also didn't sleep well. Kept having these weird dreams about walking in circles." "Parker," I said, "I think someone else is out here. Someone who's been following us, watching us. Maybe the same person who turned my flags around." "David?" Parker suggested. "Maybe he's disoriented, confused, and he's wandering around at night?" "Maybe," I said. "But if it's David, why wouldn't he respond to our calls? Why circle our camp in the middle of the night instead of asking for help?" We didn't have an answer to that. After breakfast, we decided to try a different approach. Instead of trying to navigate out, we'd search the immediate area systematically. If we were stuck in some kind of geographic loop, then maybe David was stuck in it too. And if we covered every square foot of terrain in our circling, we'd eventually find him, or find some clue about what was happening. We divided the area into quadrants and began searching, moving in careful grid patterns, marking trees as we went. It was slow, tedious work, but it was better than wandering aimlessly. Around mid-morning, I found something. A tent, set up in a small clearing, looking perfectly intact and undisturbed. The design matched the brand that David had listed on his gear manifest. "Parker," I called, "over here." He came jogging over, and we approached the tent carefully. "David," I called out. "David Ortega? This is the Forest Service. Are you in there?" No response. I unzipped the tent and looked inside. Empty. But there was gear inside. A sleeping bag, a backpack, cooking equipment. All neatly arranged, like someone had just stepped out for a moment. "This has to be his camp," I said, pulling out the backpack to check for ID. Inside, I found a wallet with David Ortega's driver's license. "So, where is he?" Parker asked. We searched the surrounding area, calling his name, looking for any sign of where he might have gone. We found a cold fire ring, some boot prints in the soft dirt, and then we found something that made my blood run cold. More flagging tape. Orange, tied to trees in a circle around the camp. But these flags weren't mine. The knots were different. Simple overhand knots, not my distinctive double overhand twist. "He marked his camp," Parker said. "Same thing you did. Created a perimeter with flags. But look at them," I said, walking the circle. "They're all pointing outward, away from camp. Maybe he tied them that way intentionally. Maybe. Or maybe." I didn't finish the thought. We returned to David's tent and did a thorough inventory of his gear. Everything was there. Food, water, first aid kit, emergency beacon, sat phone. The phone was turned on but dead, battery drained. His emergency beacon was also there, also turned off. "Why wouldn't he have activated his beacon?" I asked. If he was in trouble, that's the first thing you do. Unless he didn't know he was in trouble, Parker said. Or unless something prevented him from activating it. We found his journal in the backpack. The entries were normal at first, descriptions of his hike, observations about the weather and wildlife, notes about the terrain. But the entries from his last 2 days were different. Day 4. Can't seem to find the trail to Twin Lakes. GPS isn't working right. Keeps showing me in the same spot even though I've been hiking for hours. We'll try again tomorrow. Day 5. Something wrong with this area. All my instruments malfunctioning. Tried to navigate by sun but still ended up back at camp. Flags I put up yesterday are all turned around. Didn't touch them. Starting to worry. Day 6. Staying in camp. Too dangerous to wander. Heard something walking around my tent last night. Footsteps. Human footsteps. Called out, but no answer. We'll wait for rescue. There were no more entries. That was 4 days ago, I said. He's been missing for 4 days since this last entry. Where did he go? We expanded our search, moving in wider circles around David's camp. We found more of his flagging tape, dozens of pieces tied to trees. But they were arranged in a confusing pattern, pointing in seemingly random directions, creating a maze of orange markers that led nowhere. He kept trying to mark his way out, Parker said. But he got more and more confused. Look at this. He showed me a tree that had 3 different pieces of flagging tape tied to it, all pointing in different directions. He came back to this same tree multiple times, each time thinking he was marking a new route. It was heartbreaking and terrifying in equal measure. David Ortega, an experienced hiker, had been trapped in the same loop we were experiencing. He'd tried everything we were trying, marking routes, using instruments, attempting to navigate out. And he'd failed, and then he'd disappeared. We need to find him, I said. He's out here somewhere, probably disoriented, possibly injured. We searched until dark, covering every square foot of terrain we could access. We found more of his markers, more signs of his confused wandering, but no sign of David himself. As night fell, we returned to our own camp, defeated and exhausted. Tomorrow, we'll try the radios again, Parker said. Maybe we can get through to base, get a helicopter out here with thermal imaging. But I knew our radios wouldn't work, just like I knew our GPS units would keep showing us moving in circles. Just like I knew that any flags we put up tonight would be turned around by morning. That night, the footsteps came again. This time, I was ready. I had my headlamp in hand, and the moment I heard them start, I unzipped my tent and turned on the light. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest around our camp. And there, at the edge of the light, I saw him. A man, standing perfectly still, about 30 yards away, just watching. "David?" I called out. "David Ortega?" The man didn't respond, didn't move. He just stood there, a dark silhouette at the edge of my headlamp beam. "I'm Ranger Iris. We're here to help you. Are you injured?" Still no response. I heard Parker's tent unzip and his headlamp clicked on. The additional light revealed more details. The man was wearing hiking clothes, had a backpack on. From the build and general appearance, it could be David. "David, if you can hear me, we're here to help," Parker called out. "We have food, water, medical supplies. You're safe now." The man turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest. "Wait!" I shouted, grabbing my boots and trying to get them on as quickly as possible. By the time I was ready to follow, he was gone. Parker and I searched the area with our headlamps, but we found no sign of him. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate which direction he'd gone. "That had to be David," I said. "Who else would be out here?" "But why did he run?" Parker asked. If he's been lost for days, why wouldn't he want our help? We spent the rest of the night taking turns on watch, hoping he'd return. But he didn't. The next morning, we made a decision. We were going to stay at our camp and wait. If David was wandering this area, if he kept circling back like we suspected, then eventually he'd come close enough for us to intercept him. We set up a more permanent camp, organizing our gear, creating a signal fire that we kept burning day and night. And we waited. On the second day of waiting, Parker's GPS started showing something new. Instead of showing us moving in circles, it now showed our position as a single, fixed point. No matter where we walked, no matter how far we went, the GPS showed us in exactly the same spot. "It's like we're not moving at all," Parker said, staring at the screen. "Like we're frozen in place." "But we are moving," I said. "I can see the landmarks changing. We're definitely covering ground. Then why does the GPS show us stationary?" I didn't have an answer. On the third day, we found David's camp again. The same tent, the same gear, the same journal. But when I opened the journal, there was a new entry. Day 9. Saw rangers. Called out, but they didn't hear me. Tried to follow them, but lost them in the forest. Will try again tonight. Hope is fading. "That's impossible," I said, showing Parker. "We just found this journal 3 days ago. The last entry was day 6. Now there's a day 9 entry?" "Maybe we misread it before," Parker suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. I read it carefully. I'm sure the last entry was day 6. We searched the tent again, and this time we found something we'd missed before. A map, marked with David's route. But the marks on the map didn't make sense. They showed him moving in impossible patterns, crossing and recrossing the same terrain, ending up in locations that were miles apart but supposedly reached by walking in a straight line. He was experiencing the same thing we are, I said. The loop, the inability to navigate. His map shows him going in circles without realizing it. "Then where is he now?" Parker asked. That night, I stayed awake on watch while Parker slept. Around 2 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time, I didn't turn on my light. I just listened, tracking the sound as it circled our camp. And then I heard something else, a voice, faint and distant, but definitely a voice. "Help! Can't find," going in circles. It was David. I was sure of it. "David!" I called out. "I can hear you. Stay where you are and keep talking. I'll find you." I grabbed my headlamp and radio and started toward the sound of his voice. Parker woke and followed me. "Which way?" he asked. "Northwest. I heard him calling from that direction." We moved through the forest following the sound. But as we walked, the voice seemed to move too, always staying at the same distance, always just out of reach. "Help! Lost! Can't get out! David, stop moving! We're coming to you!" But he didn't stop, or couldn't stop. We followed that voice for nearly an hour, crashing through undergrowth, stumbling over roots and rocks in the darkness. And then, suddenly, we burst into a clearing and found ourselves back at our own camp. We'd walked in a complete circle. Parker sat down heavily on a log. "This is insane. We followed his voice in a straight line. I was watching my compass the whole time. How did we end up back here?" I didn't answer. I was looking at our camp, at our tents and gear, and something was wrong. It took me a moment to realize what it was. Our tents were facing the wrong direction. I'd pitched my tent with the door facing east to catch the morning sun, but now it was facing west. Parker's tent, which had been next to mine, was now on the opposite side of the fire ring. "Parker," I said slowly, "look at the camp." He looked, and I saw the confusion on his face turn to fear. "That's not how we set it up." "I know. Did we accidentally set up camp in a different clearing? One that just looks like ours?" I checked the landmarks. The lightning-struck pine, the distinctive boulder, the fallen log. It was the same clearing, but our camp had been rearranged while we were gone. "Someone's been here," I said. "Someone moved our stuff while we were following David's voice." "Or," Parker said quietly, "we've been gone longer than we think, and we came back to a camp we set up days ago and forgot about." The implications of that were terrifying. Were we losing time? Losing memories? How long had we actually been out here? I checked my watch. According to it, we'd been searching for David for 6 days, but that couldn't be right. We'd only planned to be out for 2 days. We had food for maybe another day, 2 if we rationed. Parker checked his watch. "Mine says 6 days too, but that's impossible. We would have run out of food." "We would have..." He stopped, looking at our food supply. We both walked over to where we'd hung our bear bags. Inside was enough food for another week, maybe more. Far more than we'd started with. "We didn't bring this much," I said. "I'm sure of it. I packed 3 days of food, 4 at most. So, where did the rest come from?" We stood there in the darkness, surrounded by gear and supplies that didn't match our memories, in a camp that had rearranged itself while we were gone, having apparently lost days of time without realizing it. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Right now. Even if we have to walk in circles, even if we end up back where we started, we need to try to leave." "Agreed," Parker said. We packed our gear in the darkness, working quickly, glancing over our shoulders at every sound. As we worked, I kept seeing movement at the edge of my vision, shadows that moved wrong, shapes that weren't quite right. When we were ready, we chose a direction at random, south, and started walking. We walked fast, almost jogging, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and that rearranged camp. We walked for hours. My legs were burning, my lungs aching, but I didn't stop. We pushed through underbrush, splashed through streams, climbed over fallen logs. Always moving south, always checking our compasses, always pushing forward. And then, just as the sun was starting to rise, we saw it. A trail marker. An official Forest Service sign indicating the trail to Crystal Lake. We'd found the trail. We'd found our way out. We practically ran the last mile to the trailhead. When we emerged from the forest and saw Parker's truck sitting in the parking lot exactly where we'd left it, I almost cried with relief. We threw our packs in the truck and got in, and Parker started the engine immediately. We didn't talk, didn't discuss what had happened. We just drove, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and that terrible section of forest. It wasn't until we were back in cell phone range, about 20 miles from the trailhead, that we finally stopped and called it in. The search for David Ortega continued for another week, but they never found him. Not his body, not any additional signs of where he'd gone. He simply vanished into that forest and never came out. Parker and I were questioned extensively about what happened. We told them everything: the backwards flags, the GPS malfunctions, the lost time, the rearranged camp. They listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. The official report concluded that we'd experienced severe disorientation due to environmental factors, possibly low-level carbon monoxide poisoning from our camp stoves, possibly some kind of local magnetic anomaly affecting our instruments. The missing time was explained as exhaustion and stress-induced memory loss. Maybe they're right. Maybe there's a perfectly rational explanation for everything that happened. But I don't think so. Because 3 months later, I received a package in the mail. No return address, no note. Inside was a piece of orange flagging tape, tied with a double overhand knot with a twist. My distinctive knot. And written on it in permanent marker were the words, Day 47. I never went back to that section of forest. I transferred to a different ranger district on the opposite side of Montana. Parker did the same, moving to Wyoming. We don't talk about what happened. We don't need to. We both know the truth, that somewhere in the Bitterroot National Forest there's a section of terrain that doesn't follow normal rules. Where compasses lie, where GPS units show impossible tracks, where flags turn themselves around in the night and camps rearrange themselves when you're not looking. Where time moves differently, or doesn't move at all, or moves in directions we can't comprehend. And somewhere in that impossible geography, David Ortega is still walking, still trying to find his way out, still marking flags that point the wrong direction, still following a map that changes every night. And maybe, just maybe, we're still there too. Some version of us still walking in circles, still trying to navigate terrain that refuses to be navigated, still losing days and gaining supplies in ways that make no sense. Maybe the version of me that's writing this, that made it out and went home, is just one possibility. And there are other versions still trapped in that loop, still searching, still trying to make sense of instruments that lie and landmarks that move and nights that rearrange the world while you're not looking. I don't know. I can't know. All I know is that I won't go back. Not ever. Because if I did, I might find out which version is real. The one that escaped, or the one that's still walking in circles, checking a GPS that says I haven't moved at all.